Need to do this every time. Okay. Oh. Oh. Those are quite nice. I don't know if I need any of them. Let me see. Shoulders, no. Um, hmm. This is nice if I would level a hunter or rogue. Not sure if I should keep it. It might just take space in my inventory. Also these I don't want anymore. Hmm. Ah, this is some nice silver. This is a good shield. Get rid of these. And we're going back to questing, herbing a bit. I mean, not questing, sorry, I'm gonna kill mobs. They know how to get damage. Let me see. Okay. Okay. Yep. Last time I was being a bit too lenient and everything, and I was expecting like but I just got spirit, I think. Still a start one. Oh right, I forgot about this thing. I almost completely forgot about it because it went to Mulgore. And it's been a while. Let's get that. Oh, okay. This is a bit faster than walking. Oh, I just I need to get some of this, but they're all like high level, and I don't have any prepared for later. I hope I will get them down the line. Uh, hmm. Let's see. Actually, because I have no roll buffs, I don't know how. I thought I had the rallying cry, but apparently I don't. So I don't know. The last time I logged in, like to check something, I think I had 2 hours, and I don't know what happened. It might have been that I stayed online or something, but the server usually logs out, so I really have no clue. Uh, anyhow, uh, let me see. And I'm not sure. Let me see my skill. 110. Alchemy 110. So pretty much I cannot learn anything, but I can actually craft. Mm, so if I were to make these, I could get to what, 120? But then still it's like hmm, Brucewood part 1. Okay, I got I got actually a ton of these. Uh, Let me actually go to the trainer, see what happens. Sorry, I'm chomping on some donuts. Mm-hmm. Okay, I cannot see the mats like this. Okay, so that might be doable. Mm, but I don't know where my major royals are. Okay, I'll learn it for the sake. This is from fishing, and this is expensive as hell. And I don't think I could make much. Yeah. Let me see unavailable. What is there as well? Lesser mana. Okay, there's strange kelp. Oh, oh, these drop a lot from fishing. Hmm. Elixir of defense. Okay, that is actually something I could need. Hmm. But I don't have the mats at all. Hmm. Oh. I know I can fish these. I also know where. I know a good spot. Hmm. Oh, and then there's after that lesser agility. But I'll need to go somewhere else. Okay, the prices are kind of fluctuating. Hmm. Okay, these are a bit different. Let's try it like this. Hmm. Hmm. Oh, I didn't expect that. I would have done these first then. Hmm. Bruce Reed, no. Yeah, this was a flop. Hmm. Let me check. A strong troll. Okay, I'll learn this. Uh, I mean, damn, I can learn this, but yeah, learn that one, and the others are. This is expensive as hell for now. This is too expensive for me to consider. Now, some people might uh, say that I'm ready to go for the whirlwind axe, but I don't think so. I don't think so. Some people have done it on retail, you know. So as I'm level 30, mm, people would go. I've seen the streams. People went and kited the. I mean, I'm talking about Cyclonian, but they have a different rules where the other mats can be bought or farmed, or actually I don't think they bought them, but somebody did farm them for them. Uh, so fuck. Sorry. I mean, I don't know. I guess I can go for some mob tagging until cooldown is off. I'll just play something. I'm sorry. Mm, I was listening to this cool disappearance thing. Let me find it. Mm, mm-mm.
Want to drink, hang out, and listen to music at the apartment on October 1st, 1980, 5 months after her disappearance. this, sometime around this time, Judith began receiving mysterious phone calls, and these were extremely strange. She got most of the calls at approximately 3:45 a.m., and this continued for years, but the caller never actually spoke. Judith was initially sure that it was Lorraine because the call frequency increased during the holiday season, and later Lorraine's aunt also claimed that she got several calls from a young woman who asked her to speak to her son Michael. Lorraine's aunt said that the girl sounded a lot like her and that she called him Mike instead of Michael, just like she did when they were kids. Unfortunately, despite all these calls, several years later, Judith would eventually need to change her phone number, at which point the calls obviously stopped altogether. And for a time, there was no new information. Another couple years later, in 1985, an investigator with an organization called Wings for Children called the doctor who ran the same hotline charged to Judith's bill. This time, the investigator was able to get a bit more information, but found that he was sort of evasive in his answers. The man claimed that runaways and exploited teens occasionally visited the home he shared with his wife, and he even said that one of them may have been from New Hampshire. It's unclear why he changed his story, and his evasiveness was strange, but there wasn't much else that could be really done. This prompted the investigator to then visit the motels in Santa Ana and Santa Monica, California the following year to see if she could turn up anything new. She would then learn that one of the motels had allegedly been used as a filming location by an infamous videographer of minors known only as Dr. Z. Unfortunately, she was never able to confirm this, and the identity of the man has never been found. That same year, back in New Hampshire, a former childhood sweetheart of Lorraine's claimed that he got a mysterious call from a young woman who identified herself as Lori. He wasn't actually home at the time of the call, but his mother relayed the information, and he was sure it had to be Lori. But after that, the case just went cold. As with many of these cases, there have been a number of alleged sightings over the years, but none of them have been substantive. So, what we know is that Lorraine disappeared one night from her home in a short window between her friend leaving and her mom coming home. She didn't take any of her personal belongings that we know of, she didn't have any money that we know of, all the light bulbs in her building had been weirdly unscrewed, and maybe most troubling, her mother received strange phone calls for years, as well as charges from across the country linked to things that no parent ever wants to find out about their child. It was around 7 o'clock on the morning of January 21st, 2008 when a security guard at a Taiwan finance building showed up for work. As he entered the building, there was little reason for him to believe that this would be anything but an average day for him, but it only took a few steps inside the front door for him to make a discovery that would turn everything upside down. Inside one of the elevators was what looked like a neat pile of clothing on the floor, a highly odd sight for a building that prided itself on order and cleanliness. The finance building was one of the few truly modern-looking structures in the area. It was an 11-story blocky monolith that stood kind of awkwardly over the low-rise rooftops of its surroundings. It also housed high-income families and professionals, people who kept things tidy and quiet. Nobody just left clothing in the elevator, so, perplexed, the guard approached the items. There was one red jacket, a smaller pink one, and 2 pairs of shoes, both neatly placed. It was also winter, and the idea that someone had walked out barefoot, let alone with a child, was immediately disturbing. Still, accidents happen. Maybe someone moved out in a hurry during the night, and maybe they'd come back for them. That seemed like a reasonable conclusion, but something still ate at the security guard. He then made his way to the security office and flipped on the monitors that controlled the building's 13 surveillance feeds. And within minutes, he found what he was looking for, and what he found only furthered the confusion. The footage showed a woman stepping into the elevator with a little girl in her arms. She looked frantic, like she was in a rush, but didn't know why. As the elevator doors closed, she stripped off her red coat and then knelt to remove her daughter's jacket too. Then came her shoes, which she placed beside her. Meanwhile, the child just stood there, quiet and unmoving, as her mother then stared at the elevator panel for the rest of the ride. The woman in the footage also looked agitated and confused, as she stared so intently at the changing floor numbers that it was like they were almost speaking to her. When the elevator reached the 11th floor, she picked up the child again and stepped out. A hallway camera then caught a brief glimpse of her turning left down a hallway and then entering a stairwell. The guard then checked the other camera feeds to see where the woman went next, but that's when his blood slowly began to run cold. There was no footage of the woman leaving the building with her daughter, and the only ways out of the building were well covered by the camera system. There was also no footage of her coming back down, no footage of her on any other floor, and nothing of her leaving. All that was left were the abandoned jackets and shoes in the elevator. When officers from the local police department arrived at the scene, the security guard wasted no time ushering them to the footage. He'd already queued up the clip from January 20th, just before 9 p.m. The elevator's interior camera provided a clear view of the woman in the video, later identified as a 37-year-old named Leo. She once again appeared in the frame, carrying her 4-year-old daughter in her arms, and her expression was impossible not to notice. She seemed tense and focused, and there was a hurriedness to her steps as if she were running late for something. She didn't pause to check her surroundings, she just moved straight to the elevator like she knew exactly where she was going. The elevator door slid shut, and then the behavior grew stranger as she removed the jackets and shoes and set them on the floor. When she was done, Leo wore only a white tank top and black vest, and she was barefoot despite the winter cold. There was also no one else in the elevator with the mother and daughter, and no indication of why she was behaving this way. The child was again silent and passive, either unbothered or too young to understand what was happening. Then moments later, the pair got off on the 11th floor, turned down the hallway, and entered the stairwell. Officers watched the footage again and again. It was deeply unsettling, not because of what they saw, but because of what they didn't. And just like the security guard, police found no trace of Leo or the child with her anywhere else in the building. It was like they disappeared into thin air. Within hours, officers were combing every floor and questioning residents. The building's architecture also made the situation even more maddening. It had a single monitored entrance and exit, and the elevator doors were locked down with keycard access between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m., a cutoff Leo had barely made. Every floor also had its own hallway cameras, and every stairwell had defined access. There were also no back doors or easy escape routes. This wasn't the type of place you could just slip out unnoticed, and yet there was no trace of Leo and her daughter. Officers then started their search at the top of the 11th floor, the last place the two were seen. Of the 4 possible units on the floor, only 2 were occupied, one by a Buddhist temple and another by a human resources agency. Police also questioned residents on other floors, but no one had seen or heard anything. There were no signs of any disturbance, no one heard unfamiliar sounds the night before, and there was nothing to indicate that a woman and her child had wandered through in the middle of the night. The stairwell also led upwards to the roof and downwards to the other 10 floors. Officers would go on to sweep every level, checking utility closets, maintenance shaft, emergency stairwells, anywhere a person could potentially hide, fit, or fall. They looked in ventilation ducts and storage spaces, above ceiling panels, and under floorboards. They then expanded their search to the surrounding blocks, hoping against hope that Leo had somehow gotten out of the building undetected, but there was no indication of that happening. Her motorcycle was also found to still be parked outside, exactly where she'd left it and untouched. The only confirmed sighting was from a teenage girl at the front of the building who saw Leo enter the lobby and approach the elevator just before 9 p.m. Neither the girl nor Leo exchanged any words during the brief encounter. There was also no overnight security guard on duty there. So next, after tracking down Leo's identity, police questioned her friends and family members, and what stood out most to them was that no one could come up with a reason why Leo would have been at the finance building at all. She didn't have friends or family who lived in the building, not even a passing acquaintance that anyone knew of. By the end of just that first day, the case had slipped from strange to surreal, and with nowhere else to turn, police started looking into Leo herself. To those who knew her, Leo wasn't the kind of person who would just vanish. She was a mother of 4 and a woman whose life revolved around her children. She came from modest beginnings in a rural part of the country, and she had been beautiful in her youth, so much so that she attracted many admirers. But her mother arranged a marriage for her instead, pairing her with a well-off local man who owned land and had enough money to provide a stable life, at least on paper anyway. After marrying, Leo settled into a 3-story home and took on the quiet life as a stay-at-home mother, as the couple had 3 children rather quickly. The man Leo was arranged to be married to, however, wasn't some wealthy Prince Charming that saved her from a life of poverty. He was instead allegedly violent and prone to bouts of heavy drinking and domestic rage. Her husband apparently made life at home a minefield, and eventually Leo had enough and divorced him. This was an act that in a conservative community like hers was met with raised eyebrows and a lot of gossip. Divorce wasn't common there, and it was an act that was looked down upon and harshly judged, but Leo couldn't take any more of her husband's outrageous and violent tendencies. Time passed afterward as the couple started their new lives apart, but her husband remained in the picture, hoping to earn Leo back. He swore he was a changed man, that he'd never drink again, and that he'd be a better husband, and so she gave him another chance. The couple remarried and had another daughter soon after, but it quickly became apparent that nothing had changed with Leo's husband. By 2008, she was for all intents and purposes a single parent, raising 4 children by herself while her husband drifted in and out of drinking binges. He was rarely home and often out at bars. The household income was unreliable too because of his drinking, and the debts were starting to stack up. The weight of all of this was starting to show too, and friends and family noticed that Leo seemed off in the days before her disappearance. Not just like she was tired and stressed, but more like unstable, like something inside her head had become unmoored. She wasn't sleeping well, and her moods shifted unpredictably. The night she vanished, she and her husband had another one of their loud arguments over his out-of-control drinking habits. Afterwards, she told her eldest daughter and her mother that she was going to visit a friend for a few days. She didn't say who she was going to visit, just that she needed to go. She didn't take her ID, wallet, or cell phone. She just grabbed her youngest daughter and left. In the absence of evidence, speculation flooded in. With no sign of Leo or her daughter anywhere in the building or outside of it, the police were left trying to build a narrative out of fragments. One of the earliest theories suggests that perhaps Leo, mentally fragile and overwhelmed, had taken her daughter to the rooftop with the intention of ending things. Police quickly determined that this line of thought was hard to support, though. The rooftop was thoroughly searched, and if Leo had jumped with her daughter, someone would have found them on the ground. But there was also no way off the roof that didn't lead straight back through the cameras. Another theory floated the idea that she'd had a breakdown and tried to discard her identity, hence leaving her ID, phone, and wallet behind. This, however, raised another question. If she did want to disappear, why bring her youngest daughter? This is where the whispers of a secret lover start to grow louder. Maybe Leo had been seeing someone in the building. After all, she did tell her eldest daughter and mother that she was off to stay with an unspecified friend for a few days. Maybe that friend lived in the finance building, but that theory didn't end up holding much water either. The building's longtime security guard had never seen Leo before, and there was no one in the building who admitted to knowing her. Friends of Leo also pushed back on the secret lover theory. Since her husband was always either at work or at bars, she was stuck at home with the children. Leo rarely had time to even leave the house, let alone begin and maintain some kind of secret affair. The most chilling theory, perhaps, though, was the simplest. That something happened to Leo inside that building, something no one saw or heard, and something no one has found any trace of to this day. Could she have encountered someone in that stairwell that took her and her daughter? But again, there's nothing on the security footage to support this. By 2013, the story had become something of a local legend. That year, local police decided to revisit the case in earnest. Maybe they'd missed something in the initial searches of the building in 2008, or maybe new eyes or newer technology could uncover something the original investigation didn't. The finance building was once again searched from top to bottom. Officers re-examined the unoccupied units on the 11th floor and questioned residents again, some of whom had moved in long after the disappearance, but nothing changed. In the end, the re-investigation turned up no fresh evidence, no new leads, and no potential suspects. If anyone in the building knew something, they weren't talking. If there was a secret path or a flaw in the surveillance coverage, it had evaded not just one thorough search, but two, 5 years apart. Almost 2 decades have passed since Leo and her daughter stepped into that elevator and vanished. And all that remains is a handful of unsettling images burned into the memories of those who have watched the footage. In a building filled with security cameras surrounded by people and designed to be secure, a mother and her child simply disappeared. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. I also want to say thanks for all the incredible story suggestions that you've all sent in. There are so many fascinating stories that have now been covered on the channel that I never would have heard of if it weren't for all of you. Also, as a quick note, as the channel has grown, as you might imagine, it's gotten harder and harder to respond to all the messages across platforms. I actually tried for a long time to respond to everything, but it just become too difficult to keep track of everyone. So I'm sorry if you sent something in and didn't get a response. With that said though, the current best way to submit a story is through the story suggestion form in the description, and if you have any other general questions, sending me an email is the best way to get in contact. But anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting, and to another edition of some of the creepiest missing persons cases. In this video, we're going over 3 cases of people disappearing that are very, very strange. These have some of the most unique and weird endings compared to many on this series. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. On April 1st, 1979, Andreas, who was an 18-year-old bricklayer's apprentice, was a passenger in a vehicle involved in a minor accident in a small town on Lake Constance in Austria. Andreas exited the vehicle unharmed, but while the circumstances of the crash have never been reported, at some point the police arrived. During their investigation into what happened, the 3 inspectors had a conversation with Andreas, and whatever was determined in that discussion somehow resulted in him being placed in handcuffs. It's not really clear why this happened because Andreas wasn't even the one driving, yet he was still being held responsible for something related to the accident. But in any case, the 3 inspectors at the scene wrapped up their investigation and Andreas was transported to the police station. When he arrived, he was apparently booked into jail, but what happened next is a mystery and would become a major point of contention. All that's known is that somehow and by someone, Andreas was led to the basement of the government building and placed in a small, cramped detention cell at some point on April 1st. On April 19th, so almost 3 full weeks later, a police officer made his way down to the basement for unrelated business. And while it's not known exactly why he went down there, the officer didn't even get to what he was originally down there for before he was hit with an ungodly stench. It wasn't the unmistakable smell of death, but it certainly wasn't pleasant, and it was strong enough for him to go looking for whatever was causing it. The officer then began to look around the basement when he approached the small detention cell. This was undeniably the source, but that didn't make sense. No one was supposed to be occupying the cell, and even if they did, it seemed too strong to be someone who was being held inside. The officer then grabbed his keys, found the right one, and slid it into the lock, but nothing could have prepared him for what he found when the cell door creaked open. There on the floor was Andreas, completely emaciated and barely clinging to life. This was an impossible find. Police had absolutely no record of anyone being kept in the basement cell, so whoever put him there had simply and tragically forgotten about him. So for 18 days, Andreas suffered in the cell alone without food or water and in complete darkness. Many of the details of how he spent his time in the basement have never been reported, but it must have been an increasingly desperate situation he found himself in, as food and water were never brought to him. He never even saw so much as a single person in the basement during his time in the cell, but that didn't stop him from trying to alert someone to his condition anyway. In the beginning, while he still had the strength to do so, Andreas screamed and shouted as loud as he could manage, hoping to get someone's attention, but his cries were never heard by anyone. Things were so hopeless that Andreas' only source of water was the condensation that would accumulate in the walls, so licking literal concrete was the only way to get any fluid in his body. Supposedly, this is the longest anyone has ever survived without water that's been reported. And obviously, this is a record Andreas never set out to achieve. Without food for 5 days, a person averages pounds of weight loss per day. Andreas, meanwhile, over the course of his 18 days, lost more than 50 pounds or 22.6 kilos. This was probably in large part due to the water he lost. About 2/3 of a person's body weight is water, and someone who goes just a day without water might feel thirsty and tired, but then go into complete organ failure by day 2. So how Andreas survived is both a mystery and a modern-day miracle. And incredibly, after just a few weeks of recuperation, he returned to work. An investigation took place in the aftermath of his discovery and uncovered some extremely concerning factors that led to his being forgotten about. In interviews with the 3 who arrested him, investigators quickly found that each of them pointed fingers at each other. In fact, when asked what they thought happened to Andreas after being arrested, each of them just assumed that one of the others had released him. And as far as how he ended up in the detention cell in the first place, that too was uncertain because of the blame each of the inspectors placed on each other. Maybe most tragically though, Andreas' concerned mother tried in vain to alert police to his disappearance, but she was mostly ignored. On the day before Andreas was found in the basement, after getting nowhere with her phone calls, she came to the police station to file a missing persons report. The officer who took it, however, used a form to take the report that hadn't been valid for 10 years to that point. So by the time it reached a superior officer who would even look at the case, Andreas was discovered in the cell. This means that she might have been quite literally standing a floor above her son who had been without food or water for almost 3 weeks. As a result of everything, the 3 inspectors were charged with gross negligence in office and put on trial shortly after. In spite of everything that Andreas had suffered through as a result of their negligence, the inspectors got a slap on the wrist and were only ordered to pay fines. Several years after the incident, the Supreme Court of Vienna awarded Andreas with the equivalent of roughly 16,000 British pounds for his ordeal. And as of today, he still holds the record for the longest ever without water. In 1986, Edgar was a 21-year-old living a sort of troubled life in Kitchener, Ontario, Canada, to say the least. He had a loving mother named Sylvia, but Edgar was just too much for her to handle as a single mother. Her son may have been an adult as far as the government was concerned, but his mind is said to have operated at the same level as a 12-year-old. It's unclear what exactly his affliction was, but he suffered from developmental and psychiatric disorders, and Sylvia found that group homes just suited her son's needs better. This, however, also meant that she didn't see him all that often. By the time August rolled around that year, the last time she had visited Edgar was under unfortunate circumstances many months earlier in January. Edgar had been taking a bunch of medications for his disorders, but that didn't keep him from spiraling into a mindset that caused him to make an attempt to end things himself. While he recovered in the hospital, it was extremely clear to Sylvia that Edgar had lost a considerable amount of weight to the point of being unhealthy. His overall well-being was in serious question afterward, but when he was released from the hospital, he returned to the group home where he was renting a room and resumed his daily life. Unbeknownst to anyone though, at the beginning of September, Edgar bought a bus ticket to Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls is a group of 3 waterfalls that separate the Canadian province of Ontario from the border of New York and the United States. And while the falls are a popular tourist destination for people from all over the world, it also happens to be a place where many people also come to end things by leaping into the falls. And no matter which waterfall a jumper chooses, once they hit the raging water below, there's no going back. Reports vary, but some suggest as many as 30 people purposely do this at Niagara Falls each year. And in fact, upwards of 5,000 people have been recovered from the pool at the bottom of the falls since 1850, according to one report. It's not known exactly why Edgar had planned a trip to Niagara Falls, but after he presented his ticket to the driver on September 2nd, 1986, for all intents and purposes, Edgar simply vanished. When Edgar didn't return to the group home, both staff and Sylvia reported him missing, but searches for the 21-year-old found nothing and he was simply gone. Several years later, in 1991, the Waterloo Police in Ontario worked with a non-profit organization called Victims of Violence to install new technology at airports. Basically, this new technology was little more than a set of TV screens that would show images of missing people with the hope that someone might recognize them. This may seem like rather primitive technology to us today, but at the time, there was hope that this advancement would lead to missing people being found and sightings reported. Unfortunately though, Edgar's photo being included still yielded nothing. 2 years later, in 1993, there seemed to finally be a breakthrough in the case as a report came in that Edgar was spotted in Hamilton, Ontario. The Waterloo Police then went to Hamilton to investigate, but the tip never materialized into anything. By then, Edgar had been missing for 7 years, and the hope that he would one day be found alive waned among investigators. For a while longer, Sylvia clung to the belief that she'd be reunited with her son. However, the case of Edgar's disappearance went all but dormant for the next 15 years. In 2008, a Waterloo detective was given the task of reinvestigating cases of missing persons that hadn't been solved, and Edgar's disappearance was among them. All of the cases that were brought back up were now being investigated as homicides. Even though there was often little evidence to suggest any of the people who vanished were killed, police now had its very best detectives on these cold cases. Even still, for Edgar, however, the new investigation into his disappearance produced nothing new despite his face appearing on missing persons posters all over the province. By this point, Sylvia had finally lost hope, and in the back of her mind, she just knew that her son had met with foul play on his trip to Niagara Falls. And for another 8 long years afterwards, Sylvia would receive nothing but silence regarding her son's case. All of that changed though in February of 2016 when it was announced that after 30 years, Edgar had been found alive. As the significant gaps in the story of what happened to him started to fill in, however, a bizarre picture began to form. It seems that at some point, after getting off the bus in Niagara Falls on September 2nd, 1986, Edgar suffered a massive head injury. Reports about his case don't detail exactly what happened that caused the injury, but it was a considerable one that left Edgar with absolutely no past memories and no idea who he was. Whether or not he spent any time in the hospital after the injury is unknown, but with no other choice and nowhere to go in his new mental state, Edgar assumed a new identity and settled in St. Catharines, Ontario. And by all accounts, he lived as fulfilling a life as he could considering his psychological and developmental difficulties. He rented an apartment, he was part of a close-knit group of friends, and he even navigated the Canadian Disability Service on his own to secure a monthly check from the government. And this was all despite suffering a severe case of amnesia. Now, TV shows and movies often depict this condition, which involves losing memories and information through some kind of head trauma. How it's portrayed, however, is rarely true to life. People who suffer from amnesia usually remember who they are and only have some memory loss, but it's also a much more complex condition that's far from simple to understand. First of all, it's not a one-size-fits-all condition. Amnesia itself has many different types, causes, and symptoms. And while head trauma is most commonly associated with amnesia, it can also result from strokes, brain inflammation, tumors, and long-term alcohol abuse. Amnesia can also be temporary or permanent. It can also affect long-term memory or short-term memory, and it can cause a loss of learned information from the past or inhibit the ability to learn new information in the future. For Edgar, it was clear that he had suffered from what's known as retrograde amnesia, which is when a person forgets past events. And considering he also exhibited the very rare symptom of forgetting his identity, it's likely that he also suffered from dissociative amnesia disorder, the hallmark of which is something called dissociative fugue. This is a state that causes severe memory loss, difficulty recognizing people the person knows, and wandering life in a perpetually confused manner. It's a condition that can last a few days or even months, and once it wears off, it's not uncommon for the sufferer to find themselves in an unfamiliar situation, like living in a new place, assuming a new identity, or starting a new job. But in any case, in January of 2016, something changed for Edgar as he started to experience these vivid flashbacks of a life he never consciously knew. By then, at 50 years old but still operating with the development of a 12-year-old, this was obviously alarming to him, and he reported these flashbacks to his social worker. During one of these flashbacks, he remembered the name Edgar, but he had no idea of its significance. The social worker then pulled up her internet browser and searched for the name, and the top hit was a missing persons report that included a much younger image of the man sitting in her office. The social worker then immediately phoned the Waterloo Police to inform them of their discovery. Later that day, the phone rang at Sylvia's house with the news, and her reaction was stunned silence. She had long ago buried her son in her mind and went on with life believing he was dead, only to find out that he spent 30 years living just 80 miles away from her in St. Catharines. To be certain this was indeed Edgar, police conducted a DNA test and compared his sample to one from Sylvia, and it came back as a perfect match for a mother-child relationship. After it was confirmed, Sylvia spoke to her son for the first time in 30 years over the phone, and the two planned an in-person reunion. The details of what exactly happened to Edgar to cause such a severe case of amnesia are still a mystery, however. Could Edgar have fallen off the bus? Or maybe he was attacked and hit his head during a robbery attempt? Or is it possible that he did go over Niagara Falls and improbably survived? It simply remains unknown, but discovering him after 30 years marked the longest recorded time a person remained missing before eventually being found, and Edgar is also the only known person to have solved their own cold case. In 1998, 14-year-old Natasha was living a rather normal life for someone her age in the city of Rockhampton in Queensland, Australia. She had lots of friends, many of whom affectionately called her Grasshopper, and she navigated the pressures of schoolwork and the struggle for independence from her parents just like any other teenager. Most of her friends knew her as the kind of girl who once spent her Christmas day visiting the sick and elderly, but some of them became aware of more concerning developments that Natasha wanted to keep secret. She started experimenting with illicit substances and once even tried to end things by her own hand. Then on another occasion, she faked a pregnancy. All of this was of course extremely alarming, but what bothered her mother Jennifer more than anything was the romantic relationship she had struck up with a 21-year-old named Scott. Jennifer obviously disapproved of the relationship, but her rebellious 14-year-old daughter didn't seem to take her mother's opinion into consideration. Then one day in July, Natasha left the house to take the family dog for a walk, but she never returned. For days, Jennifer worried sick over what could have happened to her daughter, and authorities launched a search only for them to discover her hiding out at the Rockhampton Music Bowl. Her boyfriend Scott was then charged with abduction, but that charge was eventually reduced to one of obstructing, and he was fined $1,000 for his role in her disappearance. Natasha's family was obviously relieved to have her back home safe and sound, but that peace of mind wouldn't last long. On the morning of August 31st, Natasha got herself ready for school before Jennifer dropped her off there. Later that day, Natasha once again didn't return home, and the police were notified of her second disappearance. Unfortunately, due to her running away just a month earlier, police weren't overly concerned and assured Jennifer that she'd turn up in a few days. Those few days, however, became weeks without any sign of the 14-year-old or movement in the effort to find her. Naturally, once police started to take the disappearance more seriously, the first person they turned to was Scott. Considering Scott was involved in Natasha's first disappearance, he became the most likely suspect. Just like he did in the first investigation though, Scott denied having any knowledge of where Natasha went. He was apparently just as confused and worried as Natasha's family was. So with this particular lead going nowhere, police finally went public with Natasha's disappearance. The search that followed was extensive, yet there was very little that came from the effort. There was one purported sighting of Natasha by several people who said they saw her outside a local cinema smoking a cigarette while talking to an older man, but this lead never materialized into anything, at least not initially. As weeks turned to months, another set of circumstances would come to light that would cause Natasha's case to take a chilling turn. Local Rockhampton women were starting to go missing, and 3 of them were eventually found dead. To police, it seemed clear that they had a serial offender on their hands, and fear grew that Natasha might be among the victims. In due time, this would lead police to another man named Leonard Fraser. In the run-up to the year 2000, Leonard had spent much of the previous 22 years in prison for assaulting women. In the late 1990s, however, he was a free man and showed no signs at all of having been rehabilitated while incarcerated. He continued to attack women and didn't seem to have a particular type of victim he preferred. Instead, he assaulted women of all ages, including a minor he began serving a life sentence for killing in 2000. Once he was in prison, Leonard wanted to be segregated from the general prison population, and his bargaining chip for making this happen was that he had information on a handful of murders in Rockhampton. And police were obviously extremely interested in what he had to say, and during interrogation he confessed to the murders of 5 women, including Natasha. In a subsequent search of his home, police found that Leonard had a disturbing calling card that was overlooked. They discovered several ponytails of his victims that he kept as sick trophies. As part of this confession, he said he killed Natasha after meeting her outside a cinema. According to what Leonard told police, he hit Natasha over the head outside the theater and knocked her unconscious before driving her to the Rockhampton showgrounds where he assaulted and murdered her. He then drove her to a lily pond near the local airport and deposited her remains in the water. And police had good reason to believe Leonard's account. His confessions to other murders included information on where to find the bodies, and police were successful in locating his other victims. After scouring the lily pond, however, Natasha's body never turned up. This wouldn't really matter in the eyes of the law though. Leonard was charged with her murder based on his confession, and in 2003 he was put on trial for the Rockhampton assaults. On April 11th, Leonard's trial was already several weeks underway when the morning's proceedings began with absolutely shocking news. The prosecutor then stood in front of the packed courtroom and announced that Leonard was not guilty of the murder of Natasha and those charges were to be dropped. There was an audible gasp among those in attendance, but that wasn't even the most jarring information the prosecutor shared. Apparently, one night earlier, Natasha was found and she was alive. Just prior to this announcement, Natasha's father was pulled aside by a detective and informed of the significant development, and he almost fainted in response. Outside the courtroom, her father was then handed a telephone and asked to speak to the person on the other end. He asked this person what Natasha's nickname was, and the voice on the other end responded with, "I love you, it's Grasshopper." The story of what actually happened to Natasha once the truth was learned would stun all of Australia. This is how the previous 5 years actually unfolded for her. After being dropped off at school by her mother on August 31st, 1998, Natasha never went to class. Instead, she left school and made her way to Scott's house. Scott, as it turned out, had lived a reclusive life to that point, and his neighbors knew very little about him other than that he worked as a milkman. His curtains were basically always drawn, and while he did have visitors who would stop by, neighbors just assumed he lived alone. Natasha's plan was to hide out at Scott's for a while, and since he was so secretive in the first place, it was the perfect location for her to go unnoticed. Once her disappearance started to make news, however, she grew apprehensive about coming forward, fearing what the consequences might be from both the police and her parents. As the months went by though, Natasha settled into Scott's house and moved about freely since all the windows were always covered. Then whenever Scott would have any visitors over for any reason, Natasha would hide out in a clothes cupboard. During the next few years, Natasha would spend most of her time on the internet and started learning how to speak German. She'd also read, cook, and sew, and to make her time in the cupboard a bit more comfortable, she actually took up yoga to improve her flexibility. Often, when she'd need to hide out in the cupboard, she'd have to stay there for a considerable period of time, so she'd sit in various poses. Over the next 5 years that she was with Scott, she only went outside 6 times, and when she did, it was under the cover of night while wearing men's clothing so she wouldn't be recognized. When they were at his Rockhampton home, however, she was only ever 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers away from her mother's house. Scott and Natasha were also extremely careful not to give away what they had going on. They made sure that Natasha's clothing was never hung in the outside clothesline to dry. She even went so far as to make sanitary napkins from towels so that Scott wouldn't raise suspicion by having to buy them for her. On a number of occasions during her time with Scott, Natasha contemplated coming home, and several weeks before Leonard's trial, she even called an Australian help hotline under the name Sally and said that a man was about to go to court for her murder. Finally, everything came tumbling down for the couple when a tip came into police from an unknown person that she was hiding out at Scott's house. It's unclear how this person came to know that Natasha was there, but on the night of April 10th, 2003, police conducted a surprise raid of his Rockhampton home and pressured Scott into giving up Natasha's whereabouts. After he pointed to the cupboard door, the police flung it open and found her inside. Immediately, she began to fight and protest, making it clear that she wanted to stay where she was. While these 5 years passed with Natasha missing, her family mourned as if she was dead, having believed that she had become a victim of Leonard's. On her 17th birthday, they even held a memorial service for her at a nearby crematorium where they released balloons and watched a video of young Natasha to commemorate her life. As word got out afterward, news outlets competed for a chance to tell Natasha and Scott's story. The couple was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to appear in interviews and share the details of how Natasha managed to hide out for 5 years. Natasha would tell police that she would never publicly state exactly why she ran away, but she did reveal that she was angry at everyone in her life and that she was tired of school and the life she was living. Despite this media interest in the couple's newfound celebrity, crimes had still been committed by both Natasha and Scott. Natasha admitted in interviews that it was all her doing and that she coerced Scott into hiding her, but that didn't prevent him from being convicted on perjury charges. And since this was now the second time Scott had lied to police during a missing persons investigation, the penalty was much stiffer, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. In the end, he would only serve 12 months and was ordered to pay $16,000, which would be put toward the cost of the investigation. As for Natasha, she managed to avoid any jail time and was ordered to pay just a $1,000 fine for her role in her disappearance. Not long after Natasha was found, she gave birth to the couple's first child, and right after Scott was released from prison in 2008, they married. For years afterward, they were often the subject of tabloid articles and the paparazzi, but their appearances in the public were few and far in between as they continued to live mostly a reclusive lifestyle. By the mid-2010s, the couple had all but disappeared from the headlines, and it seemed like the worst of the fallout was over. They ended up having 4 children together, and Natasha was well into a successful career as a nurse, But things took a tragic turn in the middle of 2024. On the night of June 1st, Natasha disappeared once again. This time, however, Scott really didn't know what happened to her, so he contacted the police. Then, early in the morning of June 2nd, Natasha's body was found on a golf course in Rockhampton. As of this video, her cause of death still remains a mystery, but police told reporters on the day that her body was found that the case was not being treated as a suspicious death. Regardless, the circumstances around her death add yet another strange layer to what was already one of the most peculiar missing persons cases in Australian history. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member on YouTube. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two incredibly creepy unsolved disappearances. And both of these cases have tons of evidence to suggest that something horrifying happened. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Mary Shotwell Little had built a comfortable life for herself in Atlanta over her 3 years there. After graduating from the University of North Carolina in 1962, she left her hometown of Charlotte for the possibilities of a new life in a busier city just a few hours' drive down Interstate 85. Atlanta offered her a chance to grow professionally and personally, and she got a job as a secretary at a branch of C&S Bank. Once there, she quickly impressed her coworkers with her organizational skills and warm personality, earning a reputation as both hardworking and approachable. Supervisors also came to easily trust Mary because she maintained impeccable files, making her great to work with. Making friends was also easy for Mary, and she developed a tight-knit group of coworkers and roommates who often spent time together outside the office. By September 1965, Mary was newly married to an insurance auditor named Roy Little Jr., and the couple settled into a modest home in Decatur, just outside the city. And while the happy newlyweds were still in the honeymoon phase of the relationship and Mary was independent and driven, she also had a deep appreciation for family values and often talked about how excited she was to start a family one day. She also relished the opportunity to set up their new home and took pride in decorating it so it could be shown off when the couple hosted small gatherings with friends. And likewise, known for her similarly polished appearance, Mary stood 5'6" and weighed 120 pounds with hazel green eyes and light brown hair she kept styled in soft curls. Despite her outward confidence though, Mary had a softer, more introspective side that few people saw. She was sentimental and kept handwritten letters from friends and family tucked away in her purse. She was also a hopeless romantic and was a sucker for flowers and sentimental gifts. And Roy made sure to appeal to that side of her with frequent surprises for no other occasion than just because. If she had a chance to write her story herself, Mary probably wouldn't have changed a thing, but it all came to an abrupt halt on October 14th, 1965. The day began just like any other, but she had made plans in the evening to meet up with a coworker for dinner and shopping. When the bank closed for the day, Mary hopped in her car and made a quick stop at the Colonial grocery store to buy groceries for a dinner party she was hosting the next evening. Once she had everything she needed, Mary drove over to Lenox Square, which is a popular Atlanta shopping center where Isla Stack was waiting for her. The pair then chatted over dinner at the S&S cafeteria, sharing stories about Mary's recent marriage and her proposed dinner party menu for the next night. Mary also mentioned how happy she was in her new marriage, but she also hinted that she was concerned over some recent developments at work without going into too much detail. When they were finished, Mary and Isla browsed the aisles at Rich's department store, laughing as they sifted through racks of clothing and home goods. Finally, as it got to be about 8 o'clock that night, the two decided to go their separate ways and did so with a hug and promises to see one another at work the next morning. When Isla arrived at C&S Bank on October 15th, however, Mary's desk sat completely empty. At first, no one was overly concerned. They figured maybe she was running late or had a sudden errand to take care of. As the hours passed by, however, the worry deepened. Mary had never been late before, and with her absence extending to lunchtime, calls were made to her home and eventually to the police. Roy was also out of town on business, but Mary's coworkers were able to get in touch with him, hoping that he might have some insight into where his wife was. But he hadn't heard from her either, and worse yet, he said that it didn't seem like she came home after the meeting with Isla at Lenox Square. This meant it was finally time to admit what no one wanted to acknowledge: something was terribly wrong. As attempts to reach Mary came up empty, police first scoured the parking lot at Lenox Square and actually found her car in section Yellow 32. It was her gray Mercury Comet, but something was immediately off about it. The vehicle was covered in red dust as if it had just been driven down a dirt road. Now, the state of Georgia even today has plenty of red clay dirt roads, but the area of Atlanta where Mary was known to be was almost certainly paved long ago. Even more strangely, inside the car, police also found groceries still in the backseat, but most alarming were the specks of blood that dotted the seats, the driver's side door handle, and the passenger side window. Grass clippings also clung to the dried blood stains on the vinyl where a passenger's head might have rested, and maybe most strangely, Mary's undergarments were carefully rolled and tucked between the seats. And when they were retrieved and examined more closely, police found spots of blood on those too. A black brassiere was also found in the floorboards, and a section of stocking was found neatly cut as if by a knife or scissors. There was also something about the blood that seemed different from other crime scenes police were used to. The amount wasn't any more than someone might get from a nosebleed, and there was something about it that felt staged. The placement of her personal items just didn't seem organic. They almost seemed like a deliberate attempt to confuse investigators, making it unclear whether Mary was harmed in the car, somewhere else entirely, or even at all. So next, blood samples were analyzed, revealing the likely presence of Mary's blood, but the small quantity still puzzled experts. The unusual red dust found on the car's exterior was also studied, and soil experts suggested that it could have come from a construction site or a rural dirt road, pointing to the possibility that the car had been moved after Mary and Isla left the night before. Detectives then retraced Mary's movements by interviewing store clerks and Lenox Square security officers and constructed her timeline using receipts and witness statements. It was found that the mall security officers conducted several routine patrols earlier that morning, which included Section Yellow 32, but none of them recalled seeing the gray Mercury Comet, yet by noon there it was. An examination of the odometer then revealed approximately 41 miles that were unaccounted for. Investigators could only speculate that the car may have been driven out of town and returned to the lot on the morning of October 15th. Fingerprints collected from the vehicle were then run through databases, but this yielded no matches either. Authorities then turned to forensic psychologists who speculated the perpetrator might have known Mary, as the crime seemed methodical and personal rather than impulsive. As all of this was going on, within 24 hours of her disappearance, Mary's credit card was actually used at gas stations in Charlotte and Raleigh, leaving investigators scrambling to catch up with whatever was going on. The receipts from these transactions also had what appeared to be Mary's authentic signature, which she signed Mrs. Roy H. Little Jr. The gas station attendants were then interviewed, and they gave chilling accounts as they were called a frightened woman with light brown hair and blood on her clothing, sitting rigidly in the passenger seat of a gray car, looking disoriented and refusing to make eye contact. They also described two men who were rough-looking and intense, and they were on either side of her, causing the attendants to grow suspicious. Rumors then surfaced that the men had ties to organized crime, and authorities briefly explored whether Mary had been taken as part of a trafficking ring. But despite the eyewitness accounts, the leads failed to answer questions. It sort of left detectives wondering whether Mary had been coerced into traveling across state lines, or if she was already injured or something and unable to escape. As investigators continued to dig into the lead up to Mary's disappearance, things began to emerge that made the case even more puzzling. Weeks ahead of October 14th, Mary's behavior noticeably shifted at work. Coworkers had noticed that she didn't have her usual cheerful demeanor, and she seemed distracted, often glancing nervously at the entrance to the bank, almost as if she was expecting someone to show up. Her phone calls also became brief and tense, and more than once, colleagues noticed Mary lower her voice mid-conversation while on the phone. There was also an incident with roses. There were 5 in total, and they were delivered to her desk with no card. At first, Mary smiled and brushed it off as a harmless gesture, even joking that Roy must have been stepping up his romantic game. But her smile quickly faded when she learned that her husband hadn't sent them. She then confided in a coworker that the flowers from the unknown sender made her uneasy and that she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. And the roses weren't the only sign that something was wrong. Mary began asking coworkers to walk her to her car in the evenings, and she took extra care to keep her doors locked both at work and at home. Her friends didn't press her for details, but in hindsight, they wished they all had. Mary also became nervous and weary of being alone, even during the day, and told coworkers about strange phone calls she'd receive at the office. She was also overheard saying things like, "I'm a married woman now, and you can come over to my house anytime you like, but I can't come over there." This paranoia left friends uneasy, and now it seemed completely justified. Mary's disappearance would ultimately spark one of Atlanta's largest missing person searches. Thousands of volunteers combed the area as pilots scanned the skies, and military reservists scoured the wooded areas around Lenox Square. Apparently, even jail inmates were brought in to search for any sign of her, and rewards climbed to $3,000, but no credible leads emerged. Police headquarters overflowed with clothing and personal items that were found by volunteers hoping for a match, but nothing ever led back to Mary. Investigators followed every lead they got from coworkers, friends, and strangers who might have crossed her path, but despite their efforts, the trail went cold. 18 months later, however, things took an even darker turn. After it was clear that Mary wasn't going to be returning, her position and desk at C&S Bank were assigned to a coworker named Diane Shields. Diane was 22 years old, bright and ambitious, and although she had grown up in neighboring Alabama, she moved to Atlanta to build her career, similar to Mary. And also similar to Mary, Diane had a natural charm that made her popular both in and outside the office. Diane's connection to Mary, however, ran deeper than their shared desk at C&S Bank. For a time, Diane lived with Mary's former roommates, making bonds that seemed to echo Mary's social circle, but soon enough, Diane's life began to mirror Mary's in more unsettling ways. She, too, began receiving roses at work that she tried to laugh off, but privately, Diane admitted they made her uncomfortable. Friends then noted that Diane started becoming more secretive and that she'd disappear for hours without explanation. She then also confided to one close friend that she'd been working with police, hoping to uncover answers about Mary's disappearance. This growing unease hinted at fears that she never shared with anyone and culminated on May 19, 1967, when she left work in her blue and white Chevy Impala and never made it home. Her body was later found stuffed in the trunk of her car, fully clothed with a scarf and a piece of paper shoved into her mouth. There was no indication that she had been assaulted or robbed, leaving her death just as perplexing as Mary's disappearance. And while both cases obviously share eerie similarities, authorities were divided over whether the two crimes were connected. The FBI outright dismissed any link between the cases, labeling the similarities as coincidental. Meanwhile, many local investigators disagreed, believing Diane may have stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to know. But her murder, like Mary's disappearance, remains unsolved, which has only deepened the mystery surrounding both cases. Over the years since the incidents, rumors have swirled about love affairs, blackmail, and revenge. One theory says that Mary had been abducted by someone she knew, possibly a spurned admirer or a former flame unwilling to let go. Another line of inquiry focused on the possibility that Mary may have witnessed something she shouldn't have involving organized crime, and so she was made to disappear. Another interesting piece of information came forward in 1966, before Diane was actually murdered. That year, a Reidsville State Prison inmate named Larry Stargell came forward and claimed to know what happened to Mary. According to Larry, a man named Jerry Mason was hired to kidnap her. Jerry supposedly even showed Larry her C&S Bank credit card and bragged about burying Mary near Atlanta's municipal airport. Construction workers later even reported finding a suspicious, freshly dug hole near a runway, but authorities never excavated it. Larry would eventually even provide a detailed 19-page statement, but then refused to sign it, leaving his confession and the validity of it in limbo. So, in the end, Mary's disappearance remains one of Atlanta's most haunting mysteries. With no body, no definitive answers, and only speculation to connect her to Diane, the story is as unsettled today as it was in the 1960s. The fall air was crisp as October 24, 1961 was getting underway in Lincoln, Massachusetts. It was shaping up to be a productive day, which was a good thing for 31-year-old Joanne Risch. Her schedule that day was packed, and it began with seeing her husband Martin off for a business trip that would take him to New York City. He was scheduled to stay overnight, leaving Joanne to manage the household alone, which was something she did often because of his work. Once he was on his way to Boston's airport, she turned her attention to the couple's two children, 4-year-old Lillian and 2-year-old David. Breakfast was already prepared though, and clothes were laid out before she woke each of them up to get their routines underway. They'd have to eat quickly because Lillian had a dentist appointment Joanne had to get her to, and before that, David would need to be dropped off across the street into the care of their neighbor Barbara. A couple of hours later, Joanne's to-do list had gotten shorter. Children and the dentist don't always mix so well, but Lillian had been so good during her appointment that Joanne stopped at a department store on their way back to treat the 4-year-old to a little reward. Then around 11:15 a.m., Joanne picked David up and the family arrived back home just in time to start making lunch. Once the children had eaten again, David was put down for his afternoon nap while Joanne welcomed Barbara and her son over to play with Lillian. There was no time for Joanne to sit and visit though. The bushes out front weren't going to prune themselves, so after changing into a more casual house dress and sneakers, Joanne left Barbara to watch the children before heading out to tend to the shrubs. After she finished, it was getting close to 2 o'clock, so she returned the shears to the garage and then went inside to get David up from his nap. She needed to run out again to complete the next task on her list, but instead of bringing the kids along, she once again asked Barbara if she'd mind watching them at her house. Barbara agreed, and then the whole group made their way across the street to her home before Joanne turned to leave, promising to be back shortly. Joanne's life in Lincoln seemed like it was really settling into something great. She and Martin moved into the neighborhood just 6 months earlier, and with a husband climbing the corporate ladder, 2 healthy children, and a home in a quiet historic neighborhood, she was living a life that was fairly typical of suburban family life in the early 1960s. And this was great because things weren't always so idyllic for her. When Joanne was 8 years old, her life took a tragic turn when her parents died in a suspicious fire at their New Jersey home. Joanne, who had been visiting relatives in Brooklyn at the time, returned home to find her world forever changed. She was then forced to move in with her maternal aunt and uncle who formally adopted her. Despite the tragedy though, Joanne would make the most out of her life. She graduated from college in 1952 with a degree in English literature before launching a promising career in publishing. Then, starting as a secretary, she climbed the ranks to become an editorial assistant at a prestigious publishing house. It was during this time that she met Martin, who was a Harvard Business School graduate and U.S. Air Force veteran. The couple married in 1956, moved to Connecticut, and soon welcomed Lillian into the world. 2 years after that, David was born, and a little more than a year after that, they settled in Lincoln. All in all, Joanne was living a life that she dreamed of, which only made what happened next all the more troubling. The promise Joanne made that afternoon to pick the children up after running a quick errand was the first sign that something was wrong. As the afternoon wore past 3:30 without any sign of her, Barbara became certain that Joanne had to have returned, so she walked Lillian and David back home. The house was unlocked, so Barbara ushered the 2 little ones inside and left without making any further contact with Joanne. She just figured she was busy, so Barbara didn't want to disturb her. Another 30 minutes would pass before Barbara heard a soft tapping coming from her back door. When she approached to answer, she could see through the screen that it was Lillian all by herself and in tears. Barbara then opened the door and asked the little girl what was wrong, and through her cries, Lillian said something that chilled Barbara right to the bone, saying, "Mommy is gone and the kitchen is covered in red paint." Barbara needed a moment to process what Lillian was saying, and she could have easily chalked it up to the vivid imagination of a child, but she picked Lillian up and hurried across the street. When she entered the home, Barbara could have never prepared herself for what she saw. The kitchen floor was smeared with blood with thick streaks dragged across the tiles. A telephone had also been ripped from the wall and its cord was sitting there dangling and frayed. The handset was also discarded in a garbage that sat oddly out of place in the center of the room. A bloody thumbprint also marked the wall, and a trail of blood droplets led out the kitchen door, ending abruptly in the garage near the family car. Joanne, however, was nowhere to be found. Barbara's frantic call to the police afterwards set off an investigation that would immediately puzzle detectives. Within moments, a police sergeant arrived at the house, and his initial assessment of the scene was a grim one. He actually searched the property, half expecting to find Joanne's body somewhere nearby, but when he didn't, he radioed for backup. As reinforcements arrived, smears in the kitchen began to suggest that someone had staggered around, possibly injured, yet the amount of blood at the scene, which was roughly half a pint, was far less than what might be expected from a fatal injury. There were also no bloody footprints anywhere, as if the person bleeding had floated above the floor. In addition to the blood discovered in the kitchen and outside in the garage and on the driveway, there were droplets found on the staircase, inside the master bedroom, and near a window in the children's bedroom. Several items, including a coverall belonging to David, were also found on the floor covered in blood, as if someone had attempted to clean up the various spills and streaks. 3 bloody fingerprints had also been found at the scene, but since Joanne had never been fingerprinted, police couldn't determine if they belonged to her or not. And when they were run against the FBI database, nothing came back as a match. Then, in testing the blood at the scene, it was determined to be type O, which Joanne was known to have, but it also just so happens to be the most common type. And beyond the blood, there was other interesting physical evidence left behind too. Joanne's trench coat, which she wore to Lillian's dentist appointment that morning, was still in the house, as was her purse containing cash. On the kitchen counter, a telephone directory also sat open to the page where emergency contacts would be recorded, but there were no numbers written down. In police interviews with neighbors and potential witnesses afterwards, strange details were also reported that only added to the confusion. Virginia Keene, the daughter of the family's next-door neighbors, recalled seeing a dirty, 2-tone blue car parked in Joanne's driveway earlier that afternoon. She described it as an older model, possibly a General Motors vehicle, although she couldn't provide more specifics. Another neighbor said they stopped their own car to let a vehicle back out of the driveway belonging to either the family or the neighbor, but didn't get a good look at the driver or the make of the car. Someone else who lived in the neighborhood said they saw a blue car that matched the one Virginia described parked nearby around 2:45 that afternoon. Outside the car, the witness spotted a man cutting branches and placing them in his trunk before driving off. Then on top of that, the family's regular milkman also recalled seeing a similar vehicle parked at the house 5 days before Joanne disappeared. The complexity of the scene and these statements from neighbors were more than enough to keep the police busy, but as word got out about the missing woman, more witnesses came forward and muddied the waters even further. Several witnesses said they saw a disoriented woman matching Joanne's description walking along nearby roads that afternoon. Around 2:45 p.m., a woman wearing similar clothing to what Joanne was known to be wearing with a kerchief tied around her head was spotted walking along Massachusetts Route 2A, hunched over as if she were cold. Shortly after that, between 3:15 and 3:30, another sighting was reported on Route 128 in neighboring Waltham. This time, the woman was described as having blood running down her legs and cradling something at her stomach, moving erratically as if in distress. Then by 4:30, yet another sighting was reported of a woman resembling Joanne walking along Route 128 near Chapella Road and apparently also appearing dazed and disoriented. Despite these reports, however, none were ever confirmed, and the descriptions varied just enough to cast doubt on whether any of the sightings were actually Joanne. At this point, police weren't even sure what kind of case they were investigating, and unfortunately, that would never become clear. The answer to what happened to Joanne that fall afternoon in 1961 has never come, leaving behind only speculation and uncertainty. Between the evidence, witness statements, and media written about the case over the years, it's believed that one of four possible things occurred. Joanne was murdered, Joanne was taken, Joanne had an accident, or Joanne staged the scene and ran away. And it's important to note that none of these have been ruled out, but there are some possibilities that are better supported by the evidence than others. Let's start with the possibility that Joanne was murdered in the home. When conducting a murder investigation, police generally begin by looking at the people closest to the victim. In this case, the closest person to Joanne was Martin, but his alibi was rock solid. It was confirmed that he flew from Boston to New York and was in Manhattan when Joanne was last seen in Lincoln, so almost immediately police had to rule out their most likely suspect. And since the family was also relatively new to Lincoln, Martin and Joanne had little time to develop any enemies. On top of that, the determination that only about half a pint of blood was spilled in the house indicated that whatever wound might have been suffered by Joanne was not life-threatening. This, however, doesn't discount the possibility of her being taken and killed somewhere else. In the early goings of the investigation, police thought it was possible that Joanne had been observed by an abductor in the days leading up to her disappearance. According to one of the neighbors, the night before Joanne vanished, the sound of the neighbor's garage door opening and closing was heard around sunset. When the neighbor went to investigate, they found nothing was out of place. Then on the day Joanne disappeared, the neighbor heard the garage door open and close again around 3 o'clock that afternoon, which is right around the time she would have been attacked and abducted.
So I went for a break, so and the roll box dropped, which is perfect. I played this one. Sorry for my absence. I'll keep on going.
There are many dangerous places.
Seven details of recent female shooter. I'm very concerned past world. Okay, we'll watch this later. Let's watch this one.
Covered on the channel. The most obvious of which are the caves, with their claustrophobia-inducing squeezes and deep water-filled tunnels. But the cave in this video is different. It has none of those, and yet it might be the single deadliest cave on Earth. These are some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Roughly 5 years ago, for a time, the world stood still. Airports empty, cities dimmed, loved ones were separated, holidays were skipped, and plans were put on hold. For those who fell ill or lost someone who did, the pain was deep, but the global pandemic was more than just a global health crisis. Behind the scenes, scientists began issuing a new kind of warning that this might not be the end of it. This is because pandemics don't just come out of nowhere. Often they come from hidden places where humans and wildlife meet under the wrong circumstances, like in caves, forests, and wet markets. They start in blood, saliva, and even dust, and one of the most alarming candidates for the next outbreak isn't a distant lab or bustling urban center. Instead, it's in a cave on the slopes of an ancient volcano in the Green Highlands of East Africa. That place is known as Khartoum Cave, dubbed by some as the most dangerous place on Earth. If you've followed the channel for a while, you've probably heard at least one of the cave disasters, but this is not one of those typical cave stories. Instead, Khartoum Cave is something that can, and very well may, affect all of us one day, whether we've sworn off entering a cave or not. The cave's entrance is hidden behind a waterfall that spills down from Mount Elgin. But it's no ordinary geological feature. It wasn't carved by wind or water like a normal cave. Instead, it was carved by elephants. For centuries, and maybe even millennia, animals have gone into its darkness in search of salt. They do it blindly, night after night, stumbling through pitch-black corridors in a single file. Actual savanna elephants literally transform into clumsy miners, bumping their heads on the low ceilings and scraping at the walls with their tusks. They chip away at the rock like ancient quarry workers, chewing the loosened rocks and even swallowing them whole. Over time, these efforts have reshaped the cave itself. Walls that were once smooth are now scratched and marked by generations of animals passing along a strange but vital ritual. Katoom Cave is one of 5 so-called elephant caves on Mount Elgin, but it's by far the largest, so vast in fact that an entire herd can fit inside it at once. And it isn't just elephants that go there. Buffalo, bushbuck, antelope, hyenas, and even leopards come to Katoom for the same reason, which is the promise of minerals buried deep in the mountain. The mountain itself is an extinct shield volcano, but what remains beneath the surface is a vault of minerals like calcium, magnesium, and sodium leached from ancient pyroclastic rock. And in a region where the rainfall is plentiful and vegetation is lush but nutrient poor, these salts are precious. Pregnant elephants in particular crave them, and so they come night after night bringing their calves and passing along the knowledge. At first glance, this is kind of enchanting. It's like a hidden cathedral of natural history buzzing with wildlife, but Katoom Cave attracts far more than just outside animals. Its walls are also alive with bats. Egyptian fruit bats mostly, along with smaller insectivore species deeper within. They cling shoulder to shoulder along the stone, so densely packed that it's impossible to see where one bat ends and the next begins. Every inch of the upper walls and ceilings is coated in wings and fur, and the deeper you go, the louder it gets, until the chirps echo like static from a radio. And then below them, the floor is slick with guano. This is a greenish sludge near the entrance from the fruit bats, and then darker blackened deposits deeper in. This cakes the rocks, soaks the crevices, and it fills the air with a sharp, acrid tang. For the animals who make the pilgrimage nightly, this is all just part of the journey. But for human visitors, especially those who don't know what they're breathing in, this place holds dangers far more serious than slipping on damp stone. Deep inside the cave, there's a crevasse that splits the floor to form an invisible trap of sorts. Young elephants, unfamiliar with the territory, have stumbled into it and never come out. Their bones are said to lie at the bottom, which in itself is disturbing enough, but there's something more insidious than that inside Katoom Cave. All that guano is by far the most dangerous thing you can encounter because inside it, viruses live, breed, and multiply. Every night, 1,000 microscopic interactions take place in the darkness, and one of them might be the spark that changes all of our lives. That's why virologists come to Katoom Cave, not for the scenery or for the elephants, but because something inside kills people and no one exactly knows why. In 1980, a French engineer named Charles Minette walked into Katoom Cave. What exactly he did there is unclear. He might have simply explored, maybe he touched the walls or paused to admire the bats clinging to the ceiling. Maybe he lingered too long in the guano-rich air, breathing in the cave's invisible toxins. Whatever it was, he walked out of the cave alive and never knew what he had brought out with him. 7 days later, Charles became violently ill. It started with headaches, fatigue, and muscle aches, followed by a fever, vomiting, and bleeding. His condition then worsened rapidly, spiraling far beyond the scope of any ordinary illness. He was then rushed to a hospital in Nairobi where doctors fought to stabilize him, but his condition worsened. When he finally crashed and his body gave out, one of his physicians, Dr. Shem Masoke, attempted to resuscitate him. During this, though, Charles vomited, projecting a fine mist of infected bodily fluid into the air, and the doctor inhaled it. Shortly afterward, Charles lost his fight as his internal organs had liquefied and his connective tissue broke down. This occurred so rapidly that, as one account later described, his face seemed to sag from the bone. It was as though his body had begun to melt from the inside out. Just more than a week later, Dr. Masoke also began to show the same symptoms, but unlike Charles, he survived, and from his blood, doctors were able to isolate the virus causing it. This was determined to be a cousin of Ebola, equally terrifying and completely new to them. They would call it the Marburg virus, after a 1967 outbreak in Germany where lab workers were infected by monkeys imported from Uganda. But this strain was different, it was deadlier. In 1987, a Danish boy named Raven was vacationing in Kenya with his family and visited Katoom Cave. 3 days later, he too became violently ill. And despite nearly 2 weeks of intensive care, he died in the hospital. His strain of the virus was similar to the one that killed Charles, but was genetically distinct enough to earn its own name, the Raven virus, in honor of the boy who succumbed to it. This meant there were 2 confirmed deaths years apart, both traced back to the same place. And this was enough to set off alarm bells in the scientific community. Katoom Cave was now a threat. Something in it was harboring a virus, something capable of spilling into the human population without warning. And the question wasn't just what was causing it, but why it was happening there and nowhere else. This was also enough to catch the attention of the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases. If something inside the cave could kill so quickly and gruesomely, and if it could leap from animals to humans without warning, then it was also a potential weapon of mass destruction. So in the late 1980s, a team was sent to Katoom Cave covered head to toe in protective suits and wearing respirators. Their mission was to find the natural host of the Marburg virus, identify the species carrying it, isolate the virus in a lab, learn how it works, and contain it before it jumped again. They would go on to trap fruit bats, insectivorous bats, rodents, ticks, and birds. Every animal they could catch, they sampled. They swabbed surfaces, collected guano, and took environmental readings, but nothing conclusive came up. The virus seemed to have vanished, or at least was hiding too well defined. So the military eventually packed up and left, no closer to an answer than when they arrived. In 2007, nearly 2 decades later, a break came, though not in Katoom Cave. Instead, miners in Uganda and Gabon began falling ill with some sort of fever. In response, new expeditions were launched into African gold and iron mines that harbored colonies of Egyptian fruit bats, the same species within Katoom. This time, scientists found what they were looking for. Within those bats, they isolated the live Marburg virus. Egyptian fruit bats were confirmed carriers of the virus, and they were roosting by the thousands inside Katoom Cave. Later that year, researchers once again returned to Mount Elgin with better tools. They then captured and tested bats from Katoom again, and this time they found it. It was then learned that while the virus doesn't spread through the air in the traditional sense, like a cold or flu, it can potentially be inhaled in another form. The bat guano coating the cave walls, kicked up as dust, may have carried viral particles, so you didn't need to be bitten. You just need to breathe in the wrong place at the wrong time. For Charles and Raven, that may have been exactly what happened. And what makes it all more unsettling is that there are likely more viruses in that cave than just Marburg. But quickly, let's get into what makes Marburg so dangerous and threatening in the first place. It's something known as a filovirus belonging to the same nightmarish family as Ebola. And according to the World Health Organization, it's one of the most virulent pathogens known to science, capable of killing up to 88% of those it infects. After first contact, the incubation period can stretch from 2 days to 3 weeks, and symptoms appear like a common virus: high fever, chills, headache, and body aches. But the resemblance ends there. Within days, the virus begins a systemic attack on the body. It ravages the gastrointestinal tract, causing severe diarrhea, vomiting, and cramping, and then it moves to the vascular system. Blood vessels then begin to break down, and the body's ability to clot fails. Bleeding can occur from the gums, eyes, ears, nose, and even the skin. And in the worst cases, blood leaks into the internal organs themselves. As a result, patients develop expressionless faces, sunken eyes, and a ghostly complexion as shock sets in. What makes Marburg even more dangerous, though, is how it spreads. Unlike airborne viruses, it doesn't travel through a cough or sneeze. It needs bodily fluids like blood, saliva, vomit, or urine. So doctors and nurses treating patients without proper protective gear are at extreme risk. Even handling the belongings of an infected person like towels, clothing, or bedding can be enough to pass it on. So while it's not quite as infectious as something airborne, it could plausibly spread rapidly in the right conditions. Like, for example, if Marburg were to emerge in a crowded urban area, undiagnosed even for a few days, the consequences could be catastrophic. And what's worse than that is that for now, treatment is only supportive, as in fluids, oxygen, and painkillers. It's basically damage control, and even then, survival is far from guaranteed. In 2021, as the pandemic was still prevalent across the globe, the World Health Organization issued a warning that Marburg is prone to epidemic, and the potential is still there. The right person in the wrong place, and the virus could escape containment. Maybe what's most worrisome, though, is that Katoom Cave is still open to the public. Tourists hike the trails of Mount Elgin, and school groups peer into the mouth of the cave, snapping photos from beneath the waterfall. Adventurous travelers even step into the darkness with headlamps and guides, marveling at the elephant tusk marks etched into the stone. It's likely that few even know about the threat that lies beneath their feet or above their heads. And even fewer know that the very walls around them may still harbor the virus that more or less dissolved Charles from the inside out. And as with Marburg, there is still potential for other pathogens that are just not known about yet. But for all its deadly potential, Katoom Cave remains the crown jewel of Mount Elgin National Park, and its strange beauty continues to pull people in. There's a certain kind of peace that settles over the Yorkshire countryside that feels old, ancient even. And nestled within those hills, carving a path through the heart of the Dales, is the River Wharfe. It's a gentle flowing river at first, the kind of river that seems to just meander. It's shallow and wide, and its waters flow slowly over stones worn smooth by time and beside thickets of wildflowers and green rolling fields. It's the kind of place that makes you want to take a few deep relaxing breaths. The name Wharfe is thought to come from the Old Norse word Haverfi, meaning a bend or a turn, and the river lives up to this name. It twists its way through North Yorkshire, and for centuries it's shaped the land and the people who live near it, running for 65 miles from its source high in the moors to its junction with another river. Along the way, it passes old abbeys, stone bridges, and villages with names pulled straight out of folklore. But also, like many old things in England, the River Wharfe holds mysteries and legends. While much of the river rolls wide and easy, there's one stretch that is remarkably different. Just a few minutes' walk upstream from the ruins of Bolton Abbey, the river narrows dramatically. It actually pinches in so tightly that it no longer looks like a river at all. It more resembles a harmless little stream between mossy rocks. Here, though, the River Wharfe transforms into something else entirely, something that has pulled people under and never let them go. Locals call it the Bolton Strid, and it's earned every bit of its sinister reputation. As surprising as it might seem, this is a place that kills at an unbelievable rate if you're unfortunate enough to find yourself within it. And again, from the banks, it really doesn't look like much. It's just a narrow ribbon of water flowing between rocks in a wooded glen. Even its name, the Strid, sounds kind of playful. In some places, it's also only 6 feet or 2 meters wide, almost as if daring you to leap across it. And many have, and that's how the story often begins, but step closer to the water's edge and you'll feel a subtle wrongness. There's almost a quiet roar beneath the surface where the water doesn't so much flow as it convulses. What looks like a gently moving river is actually something far more dangerous because a portion of the River Wharfe is literally turned on its side. To understand why the Strid is so unforgiving, you have to look beneath the surface. Most rivers flow with a certain transparency. You can see their shallow sections and gauge their depth, but the Strid is different. What looks narrow and manageable is actually a large vertical shaft crammed with millions of gallons of water forced through a space it was never meant to fit. This is because when the River Wharfe approaches the Strid, it undergoes a sudden transformation. It goes from a broad 90-foot or 30-meter wide channel to being squeezed into a fissure barely 6 feet across. But the river doesn't slow down to accommodate this change. Instead, it accelerates violently. The water flows into the sandstone channel at frightening speed, driving downward and twisting through a subterranean labyrinth of tunnels, crevices, and voids carved over millennia. And these aren't neat, predictable pathways either. They're chaotic, jagged, and entirely hidden from view. No one has ever fully mapped them, and no diver has even descended to explore them because none would survive the attempt. The tight channel creates immense hydraulic pressure that crushes, twists, and traps anything it grabs against its many unseen stone outcroppings. The banks are also actually more like overhanging ledges that stretch out thinly over the water below. If someone falls in, they're apparently almost immediately sucked into the bank itself, or even worse, into the depths of the labyrinth below. They'd then be thrown against the submerged rocks with all the force of the immense current. Even if this doesn't knock them out immediately, they're totally disoriented. There's no way to tell which direction is up, where the air is, or how deep the water truly goes, and all the while the current keeps pulling. Down below, the river behaves almost like it's trying to tear itself apart. Now, although that's the real danger of the Strid, it's not just the speed of the water, it's also the depth. The depth is officially unmeasured, although estimates suggest that it plunges to at least 200 feet or 65 meters. This was a figure recently determined by a YouTuber who wanted to get to the literal bottom of the mystery. If that number is accurate, it also makes it one of the deepest bodies of water in the entire country. And as a result of all of this, locals hold that the Strid has a staggering 100% fatality rate for those who enter it, either willingly or otherwise. And in fact, even without any intention of getting in, just a little too close can be the beginning of the end, because even the banks are treacherous. They're slick with moss, so one wrong step is all it takes. And again, the rocks you can see above the surface are only the tip of the structure. Beneath them, the caves, overhangs, and ledges create perfect traps and chambers that catch debris, branches, and even bodies. And that is exactly what happens. People fall in, but they don't often come out, at least not alive anyway. Some are never even found at all, and those that are have been carried miles downstream with their remains battered beyond recognition. The water in the Strid simply obliterates anything it comes in contact with, and those who end up in it are slammed against the stone again and again in total darkness until the current is finished with them. To be clear, there are no second chances here. There's no scrambling out, swimming to safety, or being lucky enough to grab onto the rocks along the banks. It is, without the slightest hint of exaggeration, one of the most dangerous stretches of water on Earth, and it's been that way for centuries. Then, in stark contrast, next to it is a soft wooded trail where tourists walk, take photos, and admire the mossy stones. A sign nearby offers a polite yet stern warning reading, quote, "The Strid is dangerous and has claimed lives in the past. Please stand well back and beware slippery rocks." And again, ask the locals and they'll tell you, nobody who falls into the Strid comes out alive. That's just the pattern, it seems. And it's a legend that comes from centuries of disappearances and grim recoveries. According to local legend, its first known victim was a noble child named William de Romilly, son of Lady Alice de Romilly, who owned the land the Strid resides on. The story goes that in 1152, young William attempted to leap from one bank of the Strid to the other. His greyhound dog, sensing something was wrong, refused to follow, but William jumped anyway and the river took him. His body was never recovered. Afterward, Lady Alice, stricken with grief, is said to have donated the land around the river to the monks of Bolton Priory in her son's memory. To this day, the priory's ruins still stand downstream from the Strid. And since then, more stories have accumulated. Centuries after the supposed death of William in 1934, the Strid claimed another life, that of Arthur Reginald Smith, a 63-year-old watercolor artist. Arthur was well known for painting natural landscapes and had likely come across the area in search of the perfect composition, but instead he drowned trying to cross the Strid. But maybe the most tragic story occurred in August of 1998. Barry and Lynn Collette were just 2 days into their honeymoon in Yorkshire. Newly married, happy, and strolling along the river wharf in Bolton Abbey, they had no idea what was coming. A flash flood triggered by heavy rain overnight caused the river to rise 5 feet in less than a minute. It's not known for sure how the couple ended up in the Strid, but police believe they were caught completely off guard by the rising waters and swept away. A hiker named Desmond, who was walking nearby with his family, later described seeing Barry's body surface briefly before being sucked back under. It took 6 days to recover Lynn's body near the weir in Addington, but Barry's wasn't found until October, 2 months later, and when it was 10 miles or 16 kilometers downstream. More recently, in 2010, an 8-year-old was near the Strid celebrating his birthday. He was spending the day with a large group of family members along the banks when he and his older brother were hopping across some stones near a picnic area just upstream from the Strid. It's a common enough thing for kids to do in the area, but the boy slipped. A fast-acting passerby managed to snag him and grab on, but the current leading into the Strid was stronger than he was, and the boy slipped out of his hands. It then pulled him under the water almost instantly. A rescue effort involving 28 people got underway, and the boy's body was found 3 hours later, long dead before anyone had a chance to save him. And these are just the stories that are known about. There are others whose names are lost to time, hikers who've disappeared, children who strayed too close to the edge, and bodies that were never found. The Strid doesn't leave much behind, yet this does little to nothing to deter anyone from coming to witness it. It's one of the most picturesque places in all of Yorkshire, and the trail through the Strid Wood is beloved by hikers, dog walkers, photographers, and families with strollers. It's not some isolated foreboding place. This is a maintained path with information plaques, stone walls, and picnic spots. The woods around it are so quiet and inviting that it's easy to forget that this stretch of river is actually a killer decorated moss. So despite its well-documented dangers, the Strid continues to attract visitors by the hundreds every day, drawn in by its natural beauty and ominous reputation. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. I also want to give a huge shout out to everyone who submits stories, comments, or anything else. As the channel has grown, as you might imagine, it's been harder to keep up with all the messages across different platforms. For a long time, I actually tried to respond to everything, but it's just impossible now. So I'm sorry if you sent something in and didn't get a reply. Also, this might be the first in a series vaguely themed around the most dangerous places on Earth. And if you're a fan of this genre, you'll probably know that the Strid is one of the most infamous in the category, so I felt it needed to be covered in the first of the potential series. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 stories featuring caves that are incredibly unique compared to the others covered on the channel. And because of these unique features, they probably never should have been entered at all, as the people in the stories found out. As always, viewer discretion is advised. About 12 million years ago, an underwater volcano formed in the Atlantic Ocean that produced many eruptions over the course of 9 million years. And with the help of tectonic plate movement, the island of Tenerife as we know it today was created. Tenerife is the largest of the Canary Islands and sits about 300 miles or 480 kilometers off the western coast of Africa. The Canaries are a chain of islands that are Spanish territory, and Tenerife is the most populated among them, with nearly 1 million people calling it home today. In terms of annual visitation, however, Tenerife sees 5 times that as one of Spain's most popular and important vacation destinations. Most tourists come for the beautiful beaches, but the landscape of the island is incredibly diverse for a landmass of just 785 square miles. Central Tenerife is home to dense pine forests, while closer to the coastline you'll find steep rocky terrain, beaches, and of course, caves. Unlike some of the places featured on the channel to this point, tourists don't feel an irresistible draw to the island's caves. Instead, the complex underground systems on the island are more of a hidden gem reserved for those with an adventurous side. Scientists take great interest in the caves of Tenerife too. That's because many of the island's caves aren't caves in the traditional sense. Instead, they're actually lava tubes. When a volcano erupts, lava travels outward through self-made channels, and when particularly thick and slow-moving lava seeps out of the earth, it remains extremely hot in the channels while the area around the lava actually cools. This causes a hard crust to form on top of even the most active lava streams. As the molten hot liquid rock flows over a long enough time, it creates tunnels that remain behind long after an eruption ceases and the lava recedes. Tenerife just so happens to have a lot of lava tubes, also known as galleries, including Cueva del Viento. This particular one holds the title of the largest volcanic tunnel in Europe at 11 miles or 18 kilometers long, and systems of lava tubes can be found all over the island, and many of them connect to one another. On Saturday, February 10th, 2007, a group of nearly 30 people gathered on the western side of the island for a hike that would take them through one of these lava tubes. The expedition was planned and organized by the Tenerife Association of Friends of Nature, and normally the outings attracted small groups, which were usually full of familiar faces. But on February 10th, a larger than average crowd showed up, including a handful of scholarship recipients of the Canary Astrophysics Institute. Together, the group set off and began enjoying the picturesque landscapes of Tenerife's peaks and ravines on a gorgeous day. At around 2 o'clock, they reached the base of a mountain that they'd need to get to the other side of, and there were only two ways that could happen, either over or through. Since this was more of a leisurely hike, the latter was the better option as a lava tube connected the two ravines. So, in a single file line, everyone began entering the tube and crouching under the low ceiling while shuffling through ankle-deep water. What none of them realized at the time, however, was that they had chosen the wrong tube, because while the hike was organized by an official nature club, there were no experienced guides leading the group. Instead, one of the club's officials received directions and instructions on his phone from someone who knew the path well. The group was essentially being led into a potentially dangerous lava tube via just a few notes jotted down on a phone. So when the trail led to a gallery opening, they figured that it must be the one they were looking for, so they continued inside. Had they walked just a little further, they would have found the correct tube nearby, but since none of the tubes had any signs outside, it was impossible for them to know that with the information they had available at the time. The group advanced further and further inside the lava tube, and by 3 o'clock they were a little over a mile beneath the mountain when everyone began feeling a little strange. Before anyone could put their finger on exactly what that was, one of them fainted and fell to the cave floor. Then another hiker fainted, and another, until 16 of 29 lost consciousness. The other 13, closer to the back of the pack, were feeling the same effects of whatever caused the others to pass out, but they managed to turn around to escape the tube. Sometime later, at around 4:45 p.m., a call was placed to emergency services by those who made it out, and members of several rescue services rushed to the scene. Still inside by that point were 16 hikers who lost consciousness, but before rescuers entered the tube, an important briefing took place between them and those who made it out. All of them reported the smell of some kind of gas around the time the others lost consciousness, so rescuers would have to be careful not to end up in a similar state as those trapped inside. Beyond that though, the effort to get all 16 to safety was not going to be an easy one. The tube the group mistakenly entered was at its largest about 6 feet wide and 6 feet high, or 2 by 2 meters, but most of it was even tighter than that. Thankfully, as rescuers made their way inside, some of those 16 who passed out regained consciousness and were able to make it out of the cave under their own power. As they continued on, somewhere around 5,000 feet or 1,400 meters, rescuers found the first of those who hadn't woken back up yet and began the process of removing them. Then, just beyond that, they began to notice the smell of gas that had been reported by those who escaped before passing out. Throughout the night and into the morning hours of February 11th, rescue workers need to proceed with an extreme amount of caution. As they located and extracted hikers further and further in, the consequences of being in the tube for long periods of time became known. 8 of the ones that were rescued that were unconscious were airlifted to a hospital with issues that varied in severity. Most of them had acute breathing issues, but 2 were in more serious condition, showing signs of muscular injuries from the awkward positions they passed out in. As the afternoon of February 11th approached, only 6 of the original 29 hikers remained inside, but rescuers were concerned about their conditions. The 6 hikers had been leading the group, and so they were the furthest inside the cave. And as rescuers advanced toward them, the smell of gas inside became stronger and stronger, suggesting that higher concentrations of it were lingering the deeper you went into the tube. Finally, about 20 hours after the hikers began what they hoped would be a fun, leisurely exploration, the rescue effort took a tragic turn as the last 6 were discovered dead. All of them had died from oxygen deprivation. The amount of time that the brain can go without sufficient oxygen is so scarce that they were likely dead long before the first part of the group escaped. It takes just 1 minute of oxygen starvation for the brain cells to begin dying, and 4 minutes later, death is just about inevitable. In the aftermath of the disaster, those who were intimately familiar with the lava tubes in the area said the hikers were in just about the worst place they possibly could have been. Tenerife is an active volcano island, and just because it hasn't erupted since the start of the 20th century doesn't mean that there isn't a lot going on underground. As rock melts under the indescribable heat inside a volcano, it produces gases that travel through the network of lava tubes. Volcanic gas is denser than air, so as it builds up and becomes more concentrated, it replaces the breathable air. Just as those who survive reported, by the time you realize you're in a dangerous area that might not have enough oxygen, it's almost too late. Fatigue sets in and rapidly advances, and once you notice it, you only have moments to reverse it by getting out of the affected area. 3 days of mourning was declared by local governments after these 6 dead hikers were discovered and extracted from the cave. It was getting late in the evening on August 15th, 1992, as friends Dave, Scott, and Alex dressed in scuba gear and descended beneath the waters of Nickjack Lake in Tennessee. And there was a good reason why they were diving under the cover of darkness. Their plan was to enter Nickjack Cave, which was forbidden by the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, due to the cave being home to an endangered species of bat. Outside the cave, a heavy chain-link fence protected the entrance, but that didn't stop Dave and his friends. Underwater, there was a gap between the fence and the bottom of the lake, so all they had to do was swim under it. This would actually be their 3rd time in the cave as well, with their 2nd coming only the night before. And funny enough, the reason for their dive was fish. Dave and his friends were after catfish, and those inside the cave were said to be of mythical proportions, maybe even as much as 200 pounds or 91 kilograms. During the dive the night before, Dave spotted one of the monsters and got a shot off from his spear gun, but only managed to graze the fish. Throughout the day on August 15th, he just couldn't get it off his mind. The fish was too big to just let it go, so this night was all about redemption. Now, in a strange way, the cave was kind of a place of second chances. Just prior to the completion of a hydroelectric dam operated by the TVA in 1967, the cave was actually dry, and one day that year, a man dressed in all black made his way inside and sat down. At the time, he viewed himself as a hopeless addict whose marriage was crumbling as a result of his habits. Inside the cave, he planned to end things, but before he went through with it, he sat deep in thought for a few hours. As he did, he had a spiritual experience that completely and instantly changed his outlook. He had come all this way to end it all, but he suddenly saw his place in life in the world. So instead of the cave being a setting for the end, it was a new beginning for, if you can believe it, none other than Johnny Cash. As incredible as that is though, the cave has a much deeper history that goes back to the Chickamauga tribe, which used it as a base of sorts for war dances and to scheme out ways to fight off settlers. Then, during the Civil War, the cave was a vital resource for the Confederacy as its high concentration of saltpeter was crucial for the production of gunpowder. Over the years that followed, there were failed attempts to commercialize it, with the main attraction being a stalagmite believed to be the largest in the world. Finally, with the completion of the dam and the Indiana bat being named a protected species in the same year, the flooding of the cave marked the end of legal exploration. As Dave, Scott, and Alex made their way deeper into the cave with their spear guns ready, disappointment began to grow as none of them spotted the fish. Visibility inside the cave was a bit better than the lake, but not by much, so as much of a letdown as it was hardly a surprise. Around 11 o'clock that night, Dave looked at his air gauge and knew it was time to head out. He looked at his friends and pointed upwards, and after receiving the OK hand signal back, the 3 started their ascent. As they came closer and closer to the surface, however, all they could see with their flashlights was an underwater ceiling, which had to have been slightly alarming. Having gone further into the cave than they realized, they were still a bit of a swim from the entrance. After feeling around the ceiling for a while, they descended again to regroup as they swam toward where they believed the way out was. This is a good time to point out that none of the men were trained or certified in cave diving. While they were experienced open water divers, cave diving requires a specialized set of skills, knowledge, and equipment. When they entered the cave that night, they had committed one of cave diving's greatest sins, which is that they went in without a guide rope. Caves that are legal to dive in will often have permanent guide ropes fixed to the entrance that lead throughout the system. In legal caves without permanent guide ropes, and even in those with fixed lines, divers will tie off their own rope to the entrance with the other end attached to a spool on their belt, and it's impossible to overstate just how important this piece of equipment is. A diver can suddenly panic or become disoriented, or visibility can be reduced to zero, but with a guide rope, divers will always be able to find safety. Without one, divers can easily be doomed in that type of a scenario. When they tried to surface once again and found only rock above them, their composure evaporated. All three of them then panicked, and in their flailing to find an exit, their fins kicked up all the loose silt that had settled in the rock walls, ceiling, and floor. This then completely blinded the three men, making their situation infinitely worse. The three men then lost track of each other, and Dave swam one way while Scott and Alex went another. Miraculously, moments later, Scott and Alex found the tunnel that leads to the entry and surfaced with one of them. As they did, they saw that their air tanks were literally a few breaths away from empty. But even more alarmingly, immediately they noticed Dave wasn't with them. After waiting a few more moments with no sign of Dave, Scott and Alex made their way for the exit to call for help. Around 2 a.m., the 911 call came into TVA and rescue agencies started to arrive, but not a single one of the more than 100 people who responded to the call was cave diving certified. If they wanted certified cave divers capable of rescuing Dave, the closest ones were located at least 2 hours away. According to the rescue commander of the lead agency, however, getting cave divers to the cave wouldn't be necessary. Based on what was known of the cave system and Dave's inexperience in such environments, this mission was a rescue in name only. The commander believed that Dave was already dead, either from drowning or hypothermia, and this influenced his decision-making. As the sun started to rise, TVA made a call to Buddy Lane, who was the captain of the local cave and cliff rescue team. During a conference call, Buddy pulled out a map of the cave that was made in 1962, before the dam was opened and the cave was allowed to flood. On it, he marked where Dave likely was when he split from his two friends, and noticed that there was a very real chance that there were air pockets nearby. If there were, they probably weren't very big, but they could at least sustain Dave long enough to be rescued. So when Buddy learned that the mission was being treated as a recovery, he could hardly believe what he was hearing. No team anywhere at the time had more rescue experience in the area than Buddy's, and he knew that you don't give up a rescue until a body's found or enough time passes that the situation becomes unsurvivable. The rescue lead, however, was firm that this was a water rescue and not a cave rescue, so Buddy's pleas to summon the help of certified cave divers fell on deaf ears. Buddy even offered to come to the scene himself to help organize the rescue effort, but this was rejected too. By this point, divers on the scene had already gone into the cave 3 times only to get turned back, further convincing the rescue lead that Dave would be dead by then. Despite this, Buddy continued to essentially beg to be allowed at the scene, but his offers were repeatedly turned down. So next, with only one option available to him, he called Mark Caldwell. Mark was an executive with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and just about the only person with the authority to change the scope of the operation. After hearing Buddy's assessment, Mark rushed the cave and took the scene over. The first thing he did after assuming command was to bring Buddy and his team lieutenant Dennis in to attempt the rescue. During his call with Buddy, Mark discussed the possibility of opening the dam to reduce the water level inside the cave, but this move would come at a heavy financial cost for the TVA. Upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of electricity production could be wasted, but after mulling it over, Mark ordered that the system operators begin to lower the level in the lake. What Buddy and Mark hoped this would do was open up the tunnel so that more air could reach Dave if he was still alive in an air pocket. Buddy estimated that if this was the case, Dave would only have a few inches of space between the water and the ceiling, and that small of a supply of air would run out soon if nothing was done to get more oxygen to him. So with Mark's call, the TVA moved more than 3.9 billion gallons of water out of the lake to drop the level by 14 inches or 36 centimeters, which was the furthest they could go without disrupting boat navigation on the lake. Once this was complete, Buddy and Dennis hurried inside the cave with their caving gear and some fins they borrowed. Now, to be clear, Buddy and Dennis were cave rescuers, but not cave diving rescuers. Thankfully though, the reduction in the water level allowed them to navigate without the need for air tanks and full diving gear. After the water was lowered, there was just enough space for them to breathe, and by just enough, we're talking about as little as 1.5 inches or 4 centimeters in some places. Deep inside the cave, Buddy and Dennis called out for Dave and then waited silently to listen for a response, but there was no reply. Pretty quickly, hope of finding him alive started to wane. A little further in, Buddy called out again and waited. Suddenly, a distant voice came echoing through the tunnel. Buddy and Dennis then looked at each other and hurried in that direction. Inside a small air pocket, there was Dave, exhausted but alive. He would end up asking Buddy and Dennis if they were angels, to which Dennis replied that they had been called a lot of things before, but angels was never one of them. As they led Dave toward the cave exit, it brought an end to a harrowing 18-hour ordeal for him. During his time inside the air pocket, Dave was convinced that he was going to die. This tiny space was only 8 inches or 20 centimeters from the water's surface to the ceiling, leaving him with a very limited air supply, just as Buddy and Mark predicted. For all that time, he clung to a small stalactite to remain above water, which did conserve his energy, but only moments before the lake was lowered, Dave could feel his breathing become more labored. After so many hours, he had used up all the oxygen in the pocket, which would have resulted in his death if not for Mark's decision and timing. And although the lake itself was lowered by 14 inches, the water level in Dave's air pocket dropped by only about 1.5 inches. Thankfully, this was just enough to open it up to the rest of the tunnel. Dave would also say that it sounded like a train barreling through the cave when fresh, cool air rushed in and basically brought him back to life. Apparently, during the end of his ordeal, Dave saw visions of 2 angels that had come to take him to heaven, and that was the reason for his odd question to Buddy and Dennis when they found him. As it turned out, Johnny Cash wasn't the only person to have a life-changing spiritual experience inside the cave. The ordeal Dave endured deepened his faith and gave him his own second chance at life. Every year, visitors flock to Weeki Wachee Wildlife Management Area just north of Tampa, Florida to catch a show you can't really find anywhere else. Inside the state park is Weeki Wachee Springs, which is home to a live mermaid show, and tourists come to watch in awe inside an aquarium-like area as divers dressed as mermaids entertain them with synchronized swimming routines. Interestingly, most who attend the show may never know it, but beneath the underwater stage is a cave system so extensive and dangerous that it's often called the Mount Everest of cave diving. And in fact, it was mostly unexplored all the way until 2007. Droughts that year finally presented a prime opportunity for cave divers from the Karst Underwater Research Team. This group would then manage to explore the system and document around 6,700 feet or 2,000 meters of passageways. This discovery of tunnels that stretch well beyond 400 feet or 122 meters in depth also put Weeki Wachee Springs at the top of the list of the deepest known freshwater cave systems in the US. With this new title, cave divers from all over the world were eager to explore the hidden reaches below the mermaid show. Unfortunately, the spring isn't exactly the type of cave where you can just show up and dive. First of all, it requires a reservation, but more importantly, conditions have to be just right in order to safely navigate the extremely tight tunnels because it has a current running through it that most divers find difficult to dive in. This is because more than 117 million gallons of water flow from the caverns every single day. And in addition to that already being an insane volume, supposedly it's one of those things that you have to experience to fully understand. In fact, it's been described as trying to climb a rock face with a fire hose blasting down at you, and these conditions have claimed lives inside the system before. As a result, the only time to explore the system in the safest way possible is during drought conditions. Florida is a state that gets a lot of rain, and in central Florida, where Weeki Wachee is located, the area can experience somewhere between 0 and 11 weeks of drought per year, making opportunities to dive the system extremely limited. One of the members of the Karst Underwater Research Team, Marson, was a successful information technology staff member at a local blood center in Gainesville, Florida. And while he loved computers, cave diving was his true passion. In fact, he was known as a bit of a thrill seeker by his family and friends, always willing to try new things that would get their adrenaline flowing. Anytime he brought up cave diving around his mother, her demeanor would understandably always be sour. She absolutely hated that Marson had picked up such a dangerous hobby, but he would always tell her that if he ever died while cave diving, then he would die doing the thing he loved most. And also unsurprisingly, although he was trained, certified, and experienced, and by all accounts a careful and cautious diver, this did very little to ease her concerns. Because of where he lived, Marson explored underwater cave systems around Gainesville at least 2 or 3 times a week, and by 2010 he had extended his passion into something that could truly help others. He had taken to rescue diving, like for example when a diver went missing that year at Vortex Springs in the Florida Panhandle. Marson was one of the volunteers who searched for him, although unfortunately the diver's body was never located. 2 years later, on March 31st, 2012, Marson traveled to Weeki Wachee Springs with the Karst team for another research dive. After the final mermaid show day wrapped up, Marson and 5 other members of the research team suited up and entered the water around 3:30 that afternoon. The divers then passed by turtles, fish, and man-made rocks using the mermaid show on their way to the entrance. Now, unlike many of the caves featured on the channel, the way into Weeki Wachee Springs Cave isn't some wide, grand opening. Instead, it's only about the size of a door, and this tight space constricts the already fast-moving current to 1,800 gallons per second. After passing through the entrance, the divers begin to encounter some of the tightest sections of the cave at around 100 feet or 33 meters, on the way to their target depth of 178 feet or 54 meters. They then reached a large open room, and after a bit of exploring, Marson signaled to the others that he was going to head for the exit. The others gave him the OK hand signal, and he began his ascent as the others followed in behind. Now, the way up and out is the most difficult part of diving Weeki Wachee Springs because of the current. On the way in, you're following the current, but on the way out, you're going against it. Kind of like flying an airplane through a strong headwind, the process is slow and it requires a lot of energy to battle the water. From around 178 feet, an orange guide rope leads up to the entrance and first takes divers through a large gallery room up to about 142 feet or 43 meters. At this point, there's a tight crevice section that begins. By following the rope, divers can find their way through the widest portion of it on the way to the entrance. It's still very tight in this section following the rope, but every inch of space can make a world of difference in this area. These extremely narrow restrictions continue for another 80 feet after that to about the 68-foot mark where things open back up and daylight above can be seen. As they ascended toward the crevice, the 5 divers behind Marson watched as he alarmingly and all of a sudden deviated from the orange rope and instead headed into one of the most constricted portions of the system. This was a confusing decision to the others, especially since Marson had been in the cave many times before and knew the way out. And not only was he going the wrong way, but it appeared as though he had overcompensated for the current as he rapidly ascended into the crack and then just disappeared. The others continued behind him at a safer pace, but when they finally reached the 100-foot mark, there was Marson completely wedged in a restriction. He seemed to be alert as he struggled to free himself from the space, but the opening he had chosen was so enclosed that even divers with side-mounted tanks would barely be able to get through. When cave divers know they'll encounter such tight sections, they'll often wear their air tanks on their sides instead of their backs. This reduces their overall profile and makes it easier to get through tight squeezes. Marson, however, was diving with a traditional setup, wearing his tanks on his back. This means he had to force himself through, probably very forcefully, only to come to a stop when there was literally no more room to move. As soon as the divers with him saw him, they sprang into action trying to pull and push him free, but it was no use. They tried signaling to Marson to establish some communication, but strangely, he acted as if they weren't there. So, with him wedged in this extremely tight space and quickly running out of gas, the others realized they need to get help immediately. They then returned to the surface quickly to alert the support team there, and within moments, they were in the water and descending to the crevice. No more than 3 minutes later, they reached Marson, and the sight of him was absolutely horrifying. He was still firmly squeezed in the rock walls, and he was completely lifeless with his mask over his forehead and his regulator floating in the current. For the better part of an hour, the divers worked to free Marson and had to resort to literally cutting his equipment off to wiggle him out. At around 4:45 p.m., he finally broke the surface. A quick check of his air gauge revealed that he still had half of his supply left in both tanks, which means he didn't run out of air while wedged in the crevice. Instead, he'd succumbed to something else and one of the most dangerous conditions a diver can experience. An autopsy was then performed, and while it was initially speculated that Marson drowned and that his regulator came free of his mouth as a result of panic, his cause of death was determined to actually be an arterial gas embolism. As you're probably well aware, as divers descend, the pressure on their bodies increases. And this pressure does strange things to the gases in our bodies. Nitrogen is absorbed into the soft tissues on the way down, but on the way back up, it releases back into the blood vessels. And if a diver ascends too quickly, nitrogen causes bubbles in the blood, which causes a whole bunch of issues. An arterial gas embolism, however, forms as a result of defying one of diving's golden rules: never hold your breath on ascent. During this stage of the dive, the water pressure on the body gradually decreases, which causes air in the lungs to expand. If a diver holds their breath as this occurs, the gas can expand to the point of bursting the lungs and cause gas bubbles to release into the arteries. And gas bubbles in the arteries are much less forgiving than those formed in the veins. Just 2 to 3 milliliters of air released into the bloodstream that goes to the brain can cause death, and all it takes for the same thing to occur in the heart is about half a milliliter. This is because the embolism simply blocks the vessel entirely, leading to a complete loss of blood flow. For this reason, an embolism is fatal more often than not, even in divers who make it safely to the surface. According to Marson's autopsy, he suffered an embolism during the ascent that caused him to become disoriented, which is why he took the wrong route up through the crevice. As he ascended, a large gas bubble began making its way from his lungs through the arteries to the heart, where it lodged in place and cut off blood flows to his lungs. Sadly, it's estimated that Marson was dead before the support team even had a chance to enter the water that day. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. As I've mentioned on a few occasions, the cave stories are getting harder and harder to come by. So if you know of any from your home country or that you haven't heard on the channel so far, you can let me know using the story suggestion form in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 more terrifying cave stories. To put it plainly, if you ever happen to be caving and encounter a section known only as the intestine, it's probably time to turn around. Unfortunately, for the people in the final story, they didn't and instead found out how the section got its name. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In December of 2002, three friends, Kylie, Megan, and Kira, and the other girls staying at a group home in Cedar City, Utah, gathered together to hear an announcement. When the girls had quieted down, one of the counselors told them that a special field trip had been planned for them on Christmas Eve. This group home was a facility that provided treatment programs for girls with substance, emotional, mood, and behavioral issues, and field trips were common, but this one was very different from the rest. Each of the girls in the house also had a unique story that led them there, but if anyone seemed like they didn't belong there, it was Kylie. The first impressions of her was that she was a goody two-shoes just from the way she looked when she first arrived at the home. She had glasses, dirty blonde hair with bangs, and dressed rather plainly, giving the impression that she was a bit of a nerd. As the other girls got to know her though, they discovered how sweet, down-to-earth, and most of all how funny Kylie was. They were always amazed by her ability to make even the saddest girls among them laugh when no one else could get them to so much as smile. Kylie was given up for adoption as a baby and was eventually taken in by an upper-class family, but unfortunately that wasn't enough to keep her from walking a destructive path as a teenager. She supposedly used drugs often and did a lot of partying, and she eventually ran away from home, and that's how she ended up in the group home. There, she made friends with Megan and Kira, and the three usually enjoyed field trips that were planned for them. When the announcement was made about the Christmas Eve trip, however, Kira couldn't shake this sudden feeling like something bad was going to happen, and she couldn't figure out why. She tried to tell the counselors and therapists at the group home about it, but her feelings were dismissed as nothing. Once the destination of the field trip was announced though, Kira understood what her instincts were trying to tell her. The counselors would be taking the girls to Bloomington Cave, which is a remote but popular underground tunnel system in the southwest corner of the state. If anything terrible was going to happen that month, Kira just knew it would be on this trip. However, the rest of the girls, including Kylie and Megan, were excited and thought that it was a cool idea for a field trip. For more than 100 years after its discovery, Bloomington Cave was a favorite hangout for Boy Scouts and cavers. Unfortunately, it was also the perfect place to do illicit substances or participate in underage drinking, which drew people who weren't terribly respectful of the cave. The walls were eventually covered in graffiti, and the ground was constantly littered with bottles, garbage, and even human waste. In addition, in 1952, Utah's Dixie Grotto Caving Club took an interest in Bloomington Cave and spent time evaluating how safe it was. Since the caving club's purpose was to preserve and further the study of caves, the club's conclusion was unexpected. They recommended that Bloomington Cave be blasted closed so no one would ever enter it. Their conclusion was that there was just far too much potential for inexperienced and unsupervised exploration. Plus, they believed the entire cave was geologically unstable, making it prone to rockfalls and cave-ins. So in January of 1953, the cave's 5 entrances were wired with dynamite and blasted to rubble. The closure wouldn't last long, unfortunately, because access points were created by teens who moved the broken rocks out of the way. A second attempt at blasting them shut occurred in 1954 with the same results. The effort was just abandoned. Later, the Salt Lake Grotto Caving Club caught wind of the cave's existence and took it on as a mapping project in 1977. They managed to measure 3,000 feet or 914 meters of tunnels, but at that point they deemed the project too dangerous to continue as well. Then in 1999, members of a local grotto club spent 3 years picking up where the previous group left off and measured Bloomington Cave to be 7,136 feet or 2,175 meters in length. Then, finally, on the morning of Christmas Eve 2002, 5 counselors and 15 girls loaded up in a van and headed south on Interstate 15 to Bloomington. An hour and a half later, and after a long unpaved road, they finally reached the parking area. Before they went inside, the girls were split in 2 groups among the 5 counselors and then told to form a straight line. A counselor was at the front of the line, then 3 of the girls, then another counselor and another 3 girls, and so on. From the outside, the group had a hard time telling where the cave was at all. The south entrance was basically a hole in the ground after all the blasting, so the counselors and the girls had to crouch and crawl just to get inside. Then once inside, it was a maze of tight corridors and wide tunnels that can be reduced to just a few feet by large boulders and rock piles. Once they got in, the counselors reformed the line and instructed the girls to hold hands. After some cautious walking and crawling around the interior, the group squeezed through a narrow tunnel one by one and entered a chamber aptly named the Big Room. This room is easily the cave's largest area and is littered with stalactites hanging from the ceiling and large boulders spread out across the floor. This natural beauty of the area was lost on many of the girls though. After going through the tight passage to enter the Big Room, some of the girls started to express their growing fear. Before entering the cave, many of the girls were excited, but the further in they went, the more they recognized that what they were doing just didn't feel safe. But regardless, the counselors reformed the line once everyone had made it through the small tunnel, and they grabbed each other's hands and continued on. Kylie and Megan were in the same group, and the two grabbed onto each other tighter and tighter as the line continued forward. At around this point, Megan noticed fear in Kylie, which automatically made her all the more scared. This was the first time Megan had sensed any fear in her at all, in all the time she'd known her. Kylie was eventually so scared that Megan had to encourage her to keep going and assure her everything was going to be alright. Just then, for reasons Megan can't remember, she let go of Kylie's hand for a second. In that split second, the sound of tumbling mixed with screaming echoed through the massive chamber before a thud brought it to a stop. Megan whipped around, expecting to see Kylie behind her, but she was gone. By that point, all the lights the group had were pointed in Megan's direction. That's when they noticed a rock ledge that dropped 150 feet immediately to their left they had no idea about. The counselors then shined their lights around the lower floor, and there was Kylie, laying motionless on the rock. Several of the counselors then rushed down to her, while the others led the girls out and called for help. When they arrived, medics ran into the cave and started making their way to Kylie, knowing every second could be the difference between life and death. When they finished climbing down more than 100 feet to reach her, though, they immediately knew it was too late. It didn't take more than a single glance at her to know there was no saving her. Afterward, it took a search and rescue team the rest of the day to remove Kylie's body and transport her to the morgue. The group home then informed Kylie's adoptive parents of the accident, and as you might imagine, they were devastated and wanted answers. Surprisingly, this would become controversial. The person who was still in charge of the group home as of 2022 told the Salt Lake Tribune that the group home bears no responsibility in Kylie's death. He pointed to the autopsy and claims the medical examiner told him that Kylie would have died no matter where she was that day because of an undiagnosed heart problem. According to his interview with the Salt Lake Tribune, he was told that Kylie's fall was the result of cardiac arrest and that no one was at fault. The more accepted explanation, obviously, was that there was a complete lack of preparedness. When the girls followed their counselors into Bloomington Cave that day, the group had only 8 light sources between all 20 of them. 5 had lamps, which each of the counselors wore, and just 3 flashlights for 15 girls to share. This is a sixth of what would typically be recommended for a group that size. Apparently, just before Kylie's fall, visibility was so low among everyone, they were literally feeling their way forward with their feet. That was the only way they could tell if there was solid ground ahead of them. It's still unclear if Kylie took a wrong step or if she lost her balance, but when the area is lit up, it's easy to understand how much of a difference being able to see makes to safety. It's important to note that the official police and autopsy reports list her cause of death as liver lacerations and blunt trauma, both caused by the fall and not her heart. The group home was never held accountable for its role in the accident. On the evening of January 15th, 1995, Frank closed his eyes as he ducked his head under the shower spray. The sun had just set outside as his mind wandered through a review of the day and what was to come in the next. Then, suddenly, he was snapped out of his daydream. A feeling had come over him, and it was a horrifically uncomfortable one. Frank's son, Conleth, who was known by Con, was supposed to be home by then after a weekend of adventure with a handful of friends. Conleth was a member of the Kevin Street Caving Club at the Dublin Institute of Technology in Ireland, and was part of a group planning to explore the Cradlehole Cave just across the border from Ireland in the United Kingdom. The 10 college students spent the previous day checking out tunnels in a different cave system that really tested them, so on Sunday, a more leisurely exploration was planned. Once that was complete, they'd begin driving the 2.5 hours back to Dublin. However, even with all that planned, Con should have been home by then. Frank then turned the shower off, and the sound of running water was replaced by faint voices coming from downstairs. In an instant, he knew his instincts were correct. After drying off and getting dressed, he rushed down the stairs to find a police officer talking to his wife. When they both turned to look at him, their expressions told him everything. Among the landscape of Northern Ireland, where bedrock has formed sinkholes, caves, and springs, Cradle Hole is the largest. Known locally as Douline, which is another term for sinkhole, Cradle Hole measures more than 100 meters long, 60 meters wide, and 35 meters deep. It was once several smaller caves beneath the surface, but collapsed long ago thanks to the river that flows through the area. Thousands of years of erosion weakened the limestone, and eventually it all sank into the earth. The river then rerouted itself to run through Cradle Hole, giving the cave a constant echo of rushing water. The cave is also divided into 2 sections, Upper Cradle Hole and Lower Cradle Hole. The upper portion requires visitors to wade through the river into large chambers with beautiful formations all around. From there, water then flows into an underground lake which is 230 feet or 70 meters long. Incredibly, the waterway that connects the upper portion with the lower portion was only discovered in 2010, and much of the river inside the cave is cold and deep. This is sort of a unique experience even in caving, making the sinkhole system a must-visit for avid cavers. At 21 years old, Khan was already a passionate adventurer who enjoyed climbing mountains. His dream was to one day summit Mount Everest, but he enjoyed caving equally as much. Also among the group of 10 entering Cradle Hole that Sunday were 20-year-old Philip and 22-year-old Patrick. Both were members of the Kevin Street Caving Club, and Patrick was one of the founders, and Philip joined about a year after its formation. And despite being a caving club, everyone in the group was relatively inexperienced at it. This was far from their first cave exploration, but there was still a lot they didn't know about the way different caves behave. Around noon on that Sunday, the college students entered Cradle Hole and advanced into a huge chamber. On the other side of it was a narrow tunnel that continued on into the system. The group then waded through the river in the direction of the tunnel, and when they neared it, Patrick told the rest of them to wait while he checked to see if it would be safe to enter. He noticed the river was moving pretty quickly in the wide open chamber, so he was concerned that the current might be too strong when it concentrated in the more narrow tunnel. On top of that, the water level was almost in line with the top of the passage. Of course, the corridor could widen out just beyond the opening, which would allow them to pass through it, but there was only one way to find out. Horrifyingly, by the time he figured things out, it was too late. The area around the karst landscape surrounding Cradle Hole had experienced several days of heavy rain leading up to January 15th, and although it was a beautiful day outside when they entered the cave, rainwater was still seeping through the limestone and into the river. This greatly increased the depth and power of its current. Patrick didn't seem to recognize the danger he was in and smiled at the others as he took a big deep breath and tried to swim against the current. All of a sudden, he disappeared. Philip was the closest to Patrick, and he entered the raging current to help his friend, but Philip was immediately trapped in the current too, and just like Patrick, it swept him away. Khan was the next one in to try to help, and within moments, he was gone, just like the others. The current had swept all three of them into a narrow passage that was so flooded there was very little space between the surface of the water and the ceiling. This meant that air would be scarce until they were spit out on the other end of the tunnel. The danger of this seemed to be lost on the other 7 group members. They stood there, expecting to be let in on the joke any second, thinking this was all a big prank. However, this anticipation slowly transitioned into fear. Just 20 minutes earlier, they first entered Cradle Hole for what they believed would be a casual cave exploration before heading home, and now they were faced with a tragedy. The 7 remaining members then split up to try to see if the other 3 were maybe trapped in another chamber, but despite searching the various passages, there was no sign of them. They searched for almost 4 hours before realizing they were going to need help from emergency services. So around 4 o'clock, the 7 cavers exited Cradle Hole and called in the incident. That sparked about 50 rescuers into action as experienced cavers and police divers raced to the cave. Outside, 2 helicopters from Britain's Royal Air Force searched the outlet area of the river, but not a single sign of the 3 was found before the search was suspended for the night. Around the same time the effort was wrapping up, authorities began informing family members that their sons were missing. There was something inside Frank that knew better though. Something inside him knew that he'd be identifying his son's body within the next few days. The next morning, the search continued, and by that point, the current and height of the river had reduced dramatically, and the hope was that the 3 men managed to find a pocket of air or a large chamber where they could wait out the water. Tragically, that wasn't the case. Around 24 hours after they first entered Cradle Hole, Patrick and Philip's bodies were found, and it would take another day for Khan's to be recovered. Today, there is a memorial plaque outside Cradle Hole in remembrance of the 3 young lives that were taken too soon. On Friday, August 19, 2016, 12 Italian scuba divers were preparing for the brilliantly blue waters on the coast of Palinuro, Italy. Situated 124 miles or 200 kilometers southeast of Naples, Palinuro is a beautiful, quaint resort town that sees tourists from all over the world every summer, and especially divers. The day's dive plan was to check out the Immersione in Parete, which translates to immersed wall. This massive underwater cliff is dotted with several cave openings and is a beautiful natural habitat for all sorts of underwater sea life, making it perfect for diving. The dive organizer was Mauro Camardella, the owner of a local diving center and a dive instructor who taught 3 different types of certifications. Camardella lived like he belonged in the water, and rarely did a day go by without the 49-year-old getting in the water. Along with him for the dive was Mauro Tancredi, who was an assistant instructor at Camardella's diving center, and their 58-year-old friend Silvio. Silvio wasn't a dive instructor like the other 2, but he was an expert in scuba diving and shared Camardella's passion for underwater exploration. Now, in addition to Palinuro being known for its gorgeous underwater rock formations and mysterious caves, it's also known for the curse of Palinuro. The town has had several diving accidents and tragedies over the years. In 1984, 2 underwater speleologists drowned during a research dive. Then, later, 3 divers from Poland died after becoming trapped in one of the caves in 1996. Then, in 2012, 4 more divers were killed when the roof of the cave they were exploring collapsed. This wouldn't be anything for the group of 12 to worry about though, because they didn't have any plans to enter any of the caves. Soon enough, all 12 divers were in the water, taking in the breathtaking views of all the beauty beneath Polinero's waters. Then, a little while later, they began resurfacing at the agreed-upon rendezvous time, around 11:30. When 9 other divers surfaced, they waited in the water for the dive organizer and his 2 friends, excitedly sharing what they thought of the immersion wall with one another. Considering the diving expertise of the 3 men who hadn't returned yet, there was very little worry among the others. They just figured the 3 of them decided to extend their dive for a while longer, or maybe they came across something they had never seen before, or they just lost track of time. Then, when the other 3 still hadn't returned to the surface after more time had passed, others began to suspect something had actually happened. Some of the divers on the excursion hurried to the wall to see if they could see any of the men, but none of them had cave diving certification. Obviously, no one wanted to be added to the list of the missing, so they remained outside the cave and continued to search the sea for them through the night. Eventually, exhausted without any luck, the authorities were finally contacted, which is something that probably should have taken place at least half a day sooner. But in any case, the Polinero Fire Service arrived sometime later, and although they were trained in underwater rescue, its members were not expert cave divers, so authorities reached out to a 61-year-old local named Fabio. He was another of Polinero's diving experts. He was actually the first to map out one of the caves in the wall called the Grotta della Scaletta. This translates to Cave of the Ladder or Ladder Cave, which was named for 2 long sections that run vertically. The cave entrance, which is only about 4 feet or 1.5 meters wide, sits on the wall about 46 feet or 14 meters below the surface. From the entrance, the first tunnel extends horizontally until intersecting with the first vertical shaft. Going down into the shaft, the bottom curves and gradually returns to horizontal, and then to the end of the bottom tunnel. At the end of this tunnel is an extremely tight restriction at around 164 feet or 50 meters below the surface. Along the bottom of this tunnel is also a combination of sand and silt, and because of how narrow it is, a silt out is a virtual certainty, especially for inexperienced cave divers who don't know how to handle that type of situation. When Fabio mapped it, he called this cramped tunnel the intestine of Polinero. And knowing what he knew, he had a feeling this story wouldn't have a happy ending. The intestine is also about 52 feet or 16 meters in length, and the undulating walls inside close in to less than 3 feet or less than a meter at some points. If they made it through this tunnel, they would have come upon a fork with one tunnel above them and another straight ahead. Choosing the tunnel above them would have taken them back to sea level, but they'd still be enclosed inside the rock, inside of an air pocket at the very top of the shaft. Even if they had ended up in the air pocket, it likely didn't have nearly enough oxygen to sustain even 1 person for very long, let alone 3. This meant there was only one hope for the men, and that was if they managed to make it through the intestine and then chose to bypass the vertical shaft and continue straight ahead. Had they done that, they would have reached the back entrance to the cave and come out into the open sea on the other side of the rock. But Fabio was sure that if they had managed to make it out the back entrance, they would have already been found. He didn't tell anyone at the scene, but it was Fabio's belief that the divers were dead long before authorities were even called. Just after he arrived, Fabio was asked to dive into the cave and see what he could find. He entered the water, made his way to the entrance, descended down the first vertical shaft, and made his way into the bottom tunnel where the opening to the intestine is located. When he entered the bottom tunnel and shined his flashlight ahead of him, he immediately stopped and turned around. When he resurfaced, he then confirmed to the Port Authority that the men were either trapped inside the tunnel or up in the air pocket of the second vertical shaft. The intestine was apparently so heavily silted out that most of the bottom tunnel still had near zero visibility. Fabio knew then that the only reason to keep searching for them was to recover their bodies. Word of the missing divers spread around Polinero, and the reaction was pure disbelief. It seemed that everyone in Polinero knew Camardella and Tancredi on some level, and their reputation as highly skilled divers. The divers' social media filled with comments and posts expressing love and hope that they'd come out of this alive, no matter how bleak things looked from the start. Then, after waiting until they were sure the silt was settled, it took rescue divers only 4 hours to find Camardella and Tancredi. Both men were dead outside the entrance of the intestine. The silt out was so bad that even though Fabio had been just a few feet from them, he was unable to see their bodies. Then later, inside the intestine, Silvio's body was found wedged in one of the narrower sections. He was held so firmly by the rock all around him that it took 6 more days to free his body from the tunnel. After their recovery, an investigation got underway to figure out what exactly had happened, and according to the official report, here's what is believed is the most likely scenario. When all 12 divers reached the wall, they split up into smaller groups to explore. It's unknown if it was planned or an impromptu decision, but Camardella, Tancredi, and Silvio entered the cave either way. Because Silvio's head was facing toward the entrance they used to enter the cave, it seems that the men had actually made it safely through the intestine, but then on the way back, Silvio got trapped. He was also in behind them when he got stuck and struggled to free himself. Then, because of how badly they had silted the bottom tunnel out, Camardello and Tancredi exited the cave without noticing that Silvio wasn't with them. They probably stopped for a moment to see if he was just lagging behind, but after a few moments they went back into the cave to try to find him. When they re-entered Scarletta, it's unknown exactly how much air they had left. It's believed, though, that they realized Silvio wasn't with them around 11:30. This would have put all three of them on the cusp of tapping into their reserve air if they hadn't already reached that point. If Silvio panicked at all as he was stuck in the claustrophobic passage, his respiration rate would have increased and his air supply would have dwindled much faster. It's thought that Camardella and Tancredi lost track of time and failed to check their air gauges as they worked to try to save Silvio. The moment they ran out of air was likely the first moment they realized they were in serious trouble. Camardella and Tancredi are seen as selfless heroes who lost their lives while trying to save a friend. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, I'd love to hear it, and you can submit it to the form found in the description. In particular, if you have any caving stories you'd like to see covered, they're getting harder and harder to come by, so if you know of any, that would be awesome. Thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 2 stories of people who are found in extremely disturbing conditions. But despite how horrifying their initial discoveries were, in each case, this would only be the tip of the iceberg. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Somewhere about 100 kilometers off the coast of the Philippines island of Mindanao, a large yacht bobbed in the ocean. The weather was clear and calm and the sun was shining brightly as far as the eye could see, and at about 40 feet or 12 meters long, the yacht would have been difficult to miss on a good day, but it was impossible to ignore on February 26, 2016. This is because the ship's hull was partially underwater and its tall mast was snapped. Christopher Rivas, a 23-year-old who was out fishing that day with some friends, saw it from a few miles away, and the group made their way toward the yacht to check it out. When they got up next to it, they got a better look at the battered ship and believed there was no way anyone could have been aboard it for some time. It was painted white with the name Sayo and had an almost haunting appearance to it, and Christopher and his friends were concerned that it could be an indication that someone somewhere was in trouble. One of them then hopped from the fishing boat onto the deck of the slanted yacht and helped a few others aboard before they made their way below deck. And what they immediately saw explained everything. Just inside the main area beneath the deck was a table next to a large electronic device that housed the radio. And sitting at the table, slumped over on its right side, was the body of a man who had clearly been dead for some time. With white and gray hair on his head and jawline, they could tell he was an older gentleman, but that's not what stood out the most about the state of his body. Instead, it was the white and gray crust that covered him from head to toe. After taking in the scene for a moment and processing what they were seeing, the friends returned to their fishing boat and radioed authorities. A little while later, when investigators arrived, they had no idea what they were walking into, but they immediately set about to secure the yacht and scour the scene. Almost right away, it was clear there was no one else on the ship with the men, and there didn't appear to be much indication that anyone had been with him for a while. It also seemed like he had been dead and floating around the ocean for some time, maybe weeks or months. Documents found on board then indicated that the man found dead was a 59-year-old German sailor named Manfred Fritz Badgerat. Over the following days, authorities were able to start to piece together the story of Manfred's life and how exactly he ended up this way. What they found was that Manfred was an accomplished sailor, so much so that he had notched more than 500,000 nautical miles at sea over his lifetime. One document that investigators found that seemed to start to piece things together was a heartbreaking handwritten note that seemed to indicate that Manfred hadn't always been sailing solo. He was at one time married to the love of his life, a woman named Claudia, who accompanied Manfred on all sorts of trips across the world. In 2008, however, for reasons that were not reported, the relationship dissolved and the couple divorced. It was around this time that their daughter was hired as a captain of a freighter known as the Renaissance, so in August of that year, in an attempt to pick up the pieces of his life and move forward, Manfred went to work for her. During his time on the freighter, he was part of a trip from Singapore to Durban, South Africa, which took him across the equator. The next stop after that was the Spanish island of Majorca, where he stayed for a while, but in 2010 he got some tragic news. Claudia had passed away after a battle with cancer, and this threw Manfred right back into an overwhelming world of grief. Several years later in 2013, Manfred got ownership of the sail, and this is where he began seemingly aimlessly sailing the seas by himself, almost like he was mourning the loss of the life he once lived with Claudia. The note that authorities found among his belongings on the ship looked like it had been recently written, providing a glimpse into the long-term heartache Manfred was experiencing from losing Claudia twice. The note read, quote, 30 years we've been together on the same path. Then the power of demons was stronger than the will to live. You're gone, may your soul find its peace. Your Manfred, end quote. Strewn around the notes were family photos of happier times, including visits to Notre Dame Cathedral and picnics in Paris. These items and their prevalence inside the yacht painted a picture of a grieving man trying to fill the void within himself on the open seas. But at the same time, as reclusive as he became, Manfred kept an active presence on his Facebook profile with regular updates and happy birthday wishes to friends. At one point in the investigation, there was a claim that he hadn't seen anybody in person since 2009, but his daughter would eventually refute that. But in any case, while these pieces were put together, medical examiners set to work on determining what exactly happened to Manfred that caused his death, and perhaps more interestingly, what happened that caused his body to be found in such a state. A complete autopsy then determined that Manfred suffered a heart attack and died, likely while radioing for help, as the transmitter was found just outside the grasp of his hand on the table. Based on him being found without clothing and the positioning of his body, it's also believed that the medical issue began in the middle of the night while he was sleeping, and that death was completely unexpected. Then, in terms of how long Manfred had been dead before he was discovered, the medical examiner said that he couldn't have passed away any more than a week earlier. This was an odd conclusion though, considering this white crust was covering the entirety of his remains. In terms of the condition of his body, Manfred was not in any kind of advanced state of decomposition, but there's a very good explanation for this that has nothing to do with how long he had been dead. It was actually because Manfred was mummified. Mummification results in soft tissues and organs being protected from the natural process of decay after death, which can be accomplished in a variety of ways. In ancient Egypt, this process was extensive. They'd start by removing the parts of the body that would decompose quickly, like the internal organs. The next thing they do is coat the body in a type of salt that is known for its ability to remove moisture from anything it touches, called natron. And the result of all of this was body preservation that would last generations. So the question is, how did this happen to Manfred? And as with most mummification, the most important part of this process was the removal of moisture. This is because bacteria and microorganisms that feast on the body and cause decomposition require water to do their work. Without it, decomposition comes to a complete halt. And while it might seem counterintuitive to expect the ocean to cause mummification, that's exactly what happened in the case of Manfred's body. Conditions in that part of the sea over the course of time he had been deceased on the yacht were perfect for the outcome that Christopher and his friends discovered in February 2016. The weather needed to be dry and breezy, and since Manfred's body was found in a relatively enclosed area, it was kept well protected from insects that might scavenge his body. Then, thanks to wind blowing and mist from the ocean, droplets suspended in the air made their way inside the yacht and began to coat Manfred's body in salt water. Then as the water dried, it left behind a hardened, salty crust similar to the results of Egyptians rubbing natron on the bodies of their dead. The only question that remains to this day is the timeline. The natural process of mummification gets underway within 2 to 3 weeks, which is in direct conflict with the medical examiner's findings. These are two facts that have yet to be rectified. As a result, the case of the mummified yacht captain has puzzled the medical community, since no one can really explain how Manfred's body became so well preserved over such a short period of time. A car had been parked in the driveway for hours, its engine cold against the damp Texas winter air. Inside, a woman sat motionless in the driver's seat, her hands resting in her lap with her head tilted slightly to the side. A gun also lay nearby, which was a sign that the act was successful. It was the morning of Christmas Eve in 2010, and it would be a while before any member of the Ruff family stepped outside and noticed the vehicle. But when they did, they knew immediately who it belonged to. It was that of Lori Erica Ruff, a woman who had married into their family years earlier before slowly withdrawing from them to the point of becoming a complete and total mystery. The family member then approached the car cautiously and peered through the side window. And although the glass had begun to fog, slightly blurring the view, it wasn't enough to veil the tragedy that had taken place inside. A call was then placed to emergency services, but it was clear before they arrived that nothing could be done. When authorities arrived, they found 2 sealed envelopes sitting on the passenger seat. One was addressed to, quote, my wonderful husband, and the other was made out to the couple's daughter with instructions not to open it until her 18th birthday, which was well into the future. However, given the circumstances, no one waited that long to find out the contents of the letters. Instead, investigators scanned page after page of incoherent ramblings and the thoughts of a woman unraveling beneath the weight of something no one understood. But although they didn't understand, to those who knew her, there had been signs for ages. After her marriage to Blake Ruff fell apart, Lori's behavior became increasingly erratic. Neighbors noticed that she and her daughter looked undernourished, as though she was barely holding things together. Lori would also pace outside, muttering to herself as if she was lost in a world of her own. And when she wasn't retreating inward, she was lashing out, sending harassing emails to the Ruff family, stealing a set of the family's house keys, and turning custody exchanges into occasions of tension and hostility. It had grown so severe that the Ruffs filed a cease and desist order against her, and yet for all the chaos that had built in the final months of her life, no one could have anticipated this end. In the end, they had lost someone they never fully understood, and as they mourned, a far greater mystery was waiting to be uncovered. Lori had always been secretive, and over the years, Blake had learned to just stop asking questions. If she was hiding something, he had reasoned, maybe it was just too painful to talk about. However, finally, standing over the remnants of a life cut too short, the Ruffs would soon discover the truth, which was that Lori Erica Ruff had never existed in the first place. Now, this realization didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, starting with the days following Lori's death when Blake and his family sifted through her belongings at her home in Leonard, Texas. When they arrived, the house was not what anyone expected. Inside, the home was in disarray with stacks of dirty dishes piled around the kitchen sink, unwashed laundry cluttering the floors, and unopened mail scattered across the countertops. And then there were also the documents. Shredded paper filled the wastebaskets torn into tiny, nearly unreadable strips. Some had also been partially burned in the fireplace, as though Lori had tried at the last moment to erase something she could no longer control. Among this clutter, scribbled notes were also found with strange phrases like North Hollywood Police, 402 Months, and Ben Perkins. The meaning of these messages was unclear, but one thing was certain, Lori had been hiding something. The real breakthrough came when the Ruffs found the lockbox. It was tucked away in her bedroom closet, sealed tight and meant to remain closed. And Blake had always received stern reminders from Lori to never lay his hands on the box, but she was gone now. So with a screwdriver, they pried it open to find a collection of documents that shattered everything they knew about her. At the top of the pile was a birth certificate belonging to someone named Becky Sue Turner, but it didn't take much digging to learn that Becky Sue Turner had died at the age of 2 in a 1971 house fire in Fife, Washington. Then, beneath it was a court document granting Becky Sue Turner the new identity of Lori Erica Kennedy. Next, there was a social security application proving she had obtained a completely new number, wiping away any connection to her past. For years prior, Blake had trusted that his wife's secrecy was simply a product of a painful childhood, but now, staring at the evidence before him, he realized it was something much worse. She hadn't just hidden her past, she had erased it. The bigger question for all of them then became why. What had she been running from, and who was she before she became Lori Ruff? From the moment they met in a Dallas Bible study class, Blake had known Lori as a private person, almost obsessively so, and back then he hadn't questioned it. She was intelligent, well-spoken, driven, and accomplished, having earned a degree in business administration from the University of Texas in 1997. And while she wasn't especially close to anyone, she carried herself with confidence, and he had little reason to doubt what she told him. Lori said she was from Arizona, that both her parents were dead, and that she was born an only child, and that she had no extended family to speak of. And so Blake, who was a kind-hearted man who came from a large, tight-knit, and prominent East Texas family, accepted her story without pressing. Whatever the reason, it was enough that she had chosen him and that she wanted to build a life together. In hindsight, however, the warning signs had always been there. Lori didn't have any photographs or keepsakes from her younger years. No one from her past attended their wedding either, after the couple decided to elope on Lori's urging after Blake's mother inquired about placing a wedding announcement in the local newspaper. Lori's reaction to this suggestion was one of alarm, and she insisted that they keep it private. So in the end, the only person to witness the two being wed was the officiant. Still, Blake loved her, and that made excuses easy. They soon settled into married life, moving to Leonard, Texas, near the Oklahoma border. There, Lori retained the same mystery she always had. She refused to talk about her past and grew visibly uncomfortable whenever anyone in Blake's family asked anything about herself. Simultaneously and strangely, however, Lori was deeply curious about Blake's family. She tracked their lineage, tried to learn the family's recipes, and memorized stories from their history as if she was trying to weave herself into the narrative. Then when the conversation would turn toward her own past, she withdrew and shut down any line of questioning. And this behavior became more concerning when she and Blake struggled to have children. Blake and Lori tried to conceive, but were met with the tragedy of miscarriage. After trying in vitro fertilization, they finally gave birth to a baby girl in 2008, marking the moment Lori became a mother and the impetus for her protectiveness to turn extreme. Afterward, she never let anyone else hold the baby. The infant would go everywhere with her, even when Lori needed to use the bathroom. And if anyone suggested they babysit for the couple, Lori refused outright. She also seemed constantly on edge, like someone might try to take their child away. As the years passed, the strain between Blake and Lori's family increased. She began to resist any connection with her in-laws, growing increasingly tense whenever they visited. Family gatherings also became unbearable as Lori remained distant and nervous, barely engaging in conversation. And eventually, she made it clear she didn't want them around at all. By the late 2000s, the marriage was fraying. The weight of her secrecy, isolation, and growing paranoia took its toll. Blake was also pressured by his family to end the marriage, as any attempt to breach the wall she had built around herself only made it higher. And in 2010, it finally all collapsed. Blake couldn't take it anymore. After several failed attempts at marriage counseling, he left Lori and their daughter to move back in with his parents. He then filed for divorce, hoping that some time apart might give them both some clarity, but instead, Lori spiraled. In the months that followed, her paranoia turned to outright hostility. Blake and his family had assumed that she would let the divorce run its course, and with time she would accept the situation, but they underestimated how deep her fear ran. Instead of moving on, Lori drove to their home, parked in the driveway, and tragically decided to end things. After the dust settled, the family handed over the documents they found to authorities, and soon investigators began peeling back the layers of Lori's deception. In 1988, nearly 2 decades after Becky Sue Turner's death, someone had requested a copy of her birth certificate. That person was Lori. Once she had the birth certificate, she only used the name briefly before taking the next step. That same year, she moved to Dallas, where she legally changed her name from Becky to Lori Erica Kennedy. Then days later, she applied for and received a brand new social security number. By this point, investigators knew that she had created her identity, but they still didn't really know who she was. She had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. There were no school records, no childhood medical history, and no family ties that could be traced before 1988. And since her social security number was new, it was unlinked to any prior identity. It was as if before the age of 20, she had never existed. Yet, there were scattered traces of her movements before she settled in Texas. All investigators could determine was that she lived in Idaho, Las Vegas, and California before arriving in Dallas. Unfortunately, still, no one knew what she had done in those places, as there were no jobs, personal references, or connections to be found. When she went to college, she applied for student loans and listed 3 references, one of which was a former classmate she had dated briefly. When investigators tracked him down, though, he had little to say other than that she had more problems than he could deal with. By the time she met Blake in the early 2000s, Lori's past was already locked away. Whatever had led her to erase herself, steal a dead child's identity, and build a new life remained a mystery. As authorities dug deeper, they struggled to find any legal or financial motivation behind her deception either. She had never used her false identity to commit fraud, steal money, or evade debts, so the question of why remained. Theories swirled, and investigators wondered if she had been escaping a troubled past. Was she maybe running from the law? Or maybe she was hiding from someone dangerous, or she had been involved with something so terrible that she had no choice but to erase herself entirely. For years, the answers remained buried, and it would take a social security investigator, a nuclear physicist, and a genealogical breakthrough to finally unravel the mystery of who Lori really was. As news of the mystery spread, it captured the imagination of amateur sleuths, true crime forum users, and investigators desperate to know what she could have been hiding. And the internet suddenly exploded with speculation. Some believe she had been in witness protection, placed under a new identity to keep her safe after testifying against a dangerous criminal. Others suspected that she was on the run from the law and that she had perhaps committed a crime in her previous life and assumed a new identity to evade capture. The mention of North Hollywood police and 402 months in her handwritten notes fueled theories that she had once been arrested or sentenced to prison, but searches of criminal records turned up no matches. Another more unsettling theory suggested that she had escaped from a cult and had gone to great lengths to sever all ties with her past. And her extreme secrecy, paranoia, and resistance to discussing her childhood lent weight to this idea in the minds of those posting possibilities. One of the most persistent mysteries was the lockbox and its cryptic notes. Who was Ben Perkins and why had she written his name down? A search led to an LA defense attorney, but he had no known connection with her. Next, the number 402 months suggested a prison sentence, possibly a reference to a case she had followed or one she feared being tied to. As the case gained attention, a social security investigator named Joe Velling took interest in uncovering the truth. His job often involved cases of fraud and identity theft, but Lori's case was different in so many ways. With the support of the Ruff family, Joe turned to the one thing that could unlock the truth, which was DNA analysis. Joe then obtained a sample using DNA from Lori's daughter, who by extension carried half of her genetic material. He would need a specialist to assist him, and that's when he tapped Colleen Fitzpatrick, a nuclear physicist turned forensic genealogist who had made a career out of solving historical mysteries through genetic analysis. Colleen had actually already cracked several high-profile cases using genealogy, including identifying the remains of a child who died aboard the Titanic in 1912. She then started by uploading the DNA sample to 23andMe and Ancestry.com with the hope that Lori's DNA would match someone already in the system, giving them a link to her past. Unfortunately though, at first the results were frustrating. The closest matches were only distant cousins, people who could only offer vague possibilities about her origins. This wasn't enough, so Colleen then spent hundreds of hours piecing together family trees, analyzing genetic markers, and tracing lines of descent through generations of data. Then, finally, there was a breakthrough. A match led to a third cousin, a woman who had no idea who Lori was, but whose ancestry provided valuable clues. Colleen then worked backward, constructing a complex web of relationships that narrowed the search to a single family line that pointed to Pennsylvania. At that point, there was another match. A first cousin came up, someone much closer in relation. Colleen now had a target, as somewhere within this extended family was the key to unlocking Lori's past, but she still didn't have a name. This final answer would come in 2016 when Joe traveled to Philadelphia to meet one of Lori's living relatives. He arrived with a folder full of photographs, placing them on the table one by one and watching the relative's face for any reaction to them. Suddenly, Joe saw a look of shock that transformed into recognition. The family member then gasped and said, quote, "My God, that's Kimberly." After nearly 3 decades, the woman known as Lori Ruff had finally been unmasked. Her real name was Kimberly McLean, a woman who had vanished from her family at 18, never to be seen or heard from again. Kimberly had basically been a ghost because she was a missing person no one ever reported missing. Born to James and Deanne McLean, Kimberly had spent her early years in what seemed like a loving, ordinary home. Her father was a carpenter, her mother was a stay-at-home mom, and she had a younger sister and childhood memories filled with family vacations, family dinners, and a handcrafted playhouse built in the backyard just for her. But something changed when her parents divorced. Deanne eventually remarried, and Kimberly struggled to adjust to her new stepfather, a new home in Pennsylvania. She apparently never really truly settled into her new life, and her resentment grew toward her mother and stepfather and the upheaval they'd both caused in her eyes. So in 1986, when she turned 18, Kimberly made a decision that would alter the course of her life forever by just walking away. Her departure, though, wasn't just an impulsive act of teenage rebellion. She severed all contact, told her mother not to come after her, and disappeared. And for years afterward, her family had no idea what happened to her. They tried to find her, but obviously, Kimberly had ensured they never could. For decades afterward, no one put the pieces together, and when she died in 2010, it seemed as though the mystery of her past would remain unsolved forever. Obviously, this didn't end up being the case, but even after her real identity was uncovered, Kimberly's motivations remained unclear. She hadn't been running from the law or part of some government operation like the internet speculated. There was also no evidence that she committed a crime or was forced into hiding. She had simply walked away, but still, why? To those who knew her before she disappeared, Kimberly had been a normal, if somewhat withdrawn teenager struggling with the fallout of her parents' divorce. She hadn't been involved in anything that would suggest a reason for such an extreme decision. And for decades, she maintained the deception, never once slipping up. Even in moments of deep intimacy, even when there was no risk of telling the truth, she never revealed who she really was. Instead, she lived in constant fear, but fear of what exactly is still uncertain. Her extreme secrecy and paranoia suggested something more than a simple desire to start over. Mental illness had never been discussed publicly in relation to Lori Ruff, but some have speculated that she may have suffered from untreated paranoia, delusions, or disassociation. All states of mind that could have led her to believe she was in danger, even when no real threat existed. And the final years of her life only added to the mystery. Her erratic behavior, her rapid weight loss, her obsession with controlling every aspect of her daughter's life, these were not the actions of someone who had successfully escaped the past. These were the actions of someone still running from it. And yet, in the end, it wasn't the past that caught up with her. It was the unbearable weight of the life she had built and the loneliness of a person who had spent decades constructing a false identity only to watch it crumble when her marriage fell apart. It's only by the work of Joe, Colleen, and the Ruff family that the truth of who Lori really was has been revealed. But it seems that even in death, she took her real story with her. And maybe that was exactly what she had intended all along. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two creepy cases that were initially unsolved, but very slowly pieces began to be discovered, and when the truth was finally learned, each was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. And now more than ever, although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. On a hot August day in 1979, the phone rang at a sheriff's office in Idaho and Earl Holden picked it up. On the other end of the line was dispatch, which had just received a strange report about a suspicious bag found by a family of artifact hunters who were spending the afternoon searching for arrowheads. The bag, which appeared to the family to be an old burlap sack, was stumbled upon inside Buffalo Cave, about 100 miles to the west of the Idaho city of Dubois. After hanging up the phone, Earl grabbed his hat and headed out to his patrol vehicle to begin the journey to Craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve, where Buffalo Cave is located. When he arrived, he was led to the cave by the family and got his first look at the bag, which was found inside a shallow hole. Without disturbing it too much, Earl had a look inside and noticed tatters of clothing and a reddish-brown object that was difficult to discern at first. When he finally realized what he was probably looking at, he had no idea just how improbable a story the item would end up telling. A search of the bag's surroundings found nothing more, and after the bag had been photographed and documented at the scene, it was transported to the medical examiner's office in Clark County. At the scene, the coroner determined that inside the burlap sack was a headless, limbless human torso, which was little more than a pelvic bone and a set of vertebrae. And after a thorough examination in the office, he came to several conclusions about these strange set of human remains. First was that they belonged to a 25 to 45-year-old white male who stood between 5'5" and 6'1" and had reddish-brown hair. Second was that the man had been wearing a maroon sweater, a white collared shirt with blue pinstripes, and a pair of black pants when he died. And 3, he had been killed and literally taken apart afterward, sometime between 1969 and the body being discovered. Based on the examination, a few further assumptions could be made. The death likely occurred at a different location than where the body was dumped inside Buffalo Cave, and the taking apart was a gruesome affair, although that conclusion didn't take much to come to. The marks on the torso showed that multiple methods and tools were used to remove the head and limbs. The arm and leg bones also weren't separated at the joints, instead both sharp and blunt objects were used to separate at the midpoints. And finally, the vertebrae in the neck showed signs of contact with a sharp object of some kind, which more than likely resulted in the removal of the head. In the initial stages, there seemed to be a lot for police to go on, but in truth, the case went nowhere fast. Without a head, identification of the individual the torso belonged to was impossible at the time. And not only that, Earl disagreed with the coroner's findings based on the clothing he saw inside the sack. They didn't appear to be the type of clothes someone in the late 60s or early 70s would be wearing. To him, they resembled something a gambler from the early 1900s would wear. And unfortunately, although news broke of the torso's discovery, few leads came in, and those that did were quickly ruled out as possibilities. The case of the Buffalo Cave torso, as it became known, went cold for more than a decade until a girl exploring the cave discovered a skeletal hand in 1991. This sparked police into further action at Buffalo Cave, and a more extensive search and excavation took place to see if more parts belonging to the torso could be found. And sure enough, the remnants of the victim's arms and legs were located and discovered to be well preserved, all things considered. There was even some skin still attached to some of the bones. Unfortunately, there was nothing to fingerprint, however, as the fingers were completely decomposed down to the bone, so once again, despite a solid discovery, police were left wondering who it was they found in Buffalo Cave. Another 6 years would pass before the sheriff's department would ask for assistance from the Idaho State University Anthropology Department. The remains were then transported there and work got underway to uncover the identity of the torso, but anthropologists had little to no luck making any headway in the case either. It wouldn't be until 2015 when another extensive search and excavation took place inside the cave in a concerted effort to locate the missing head, but even to this day it has never been found. So, identification seemed completely unlikely and the headless remains were stored away in a secure lab for another few years. With the rise in popularity a few years later of consumer DNA tests came a new opportunity for the Idaho State University team. In more recent years, DNA testing has become a critical tool for people who piece together family trees. And what police have discovered is that this same approach can be used to solve cold cases, as a variety of websites now have large DNA databases to compare samples to. It's a somewhat controversial method, but one that has solved high-profile cold cases, like that of the infamous Golden State Killer. So in early 2019, the anthropology department at Idaho State University reached out to the DNA Doe Project, which is a non-profit organization that specializes in uncovering identities using the same genealogical methods. A sample was then obtained from the Buffalo Cave torso, and once a solid profile had been obtained, the results were returned to the DNA Doe Project in July and research began. Finally, on October 28, 2019, the team was confident they had found their man. What they discovered was that the man the torso belonged to still had a living grandchild who was an 87-year-old man living in California. He was then contacted and agreed to have his DNA sample taken to confirm his relation to the man the Buffalo Cave torso belonged to. When it did, the DNA profile from the suspected grandson was found to be a 100% match for a grandfather-grandchild relationship. And with that, the torso was then confirmed to belong to Joseph Henry Lovelace, and he was not a gambler who was killed between 1969 and 1979. His murder instead took place in 1916, and while this may seem like the ending to a decades-long mystery, things were only just starting to get interesting. Joseph Henry Lovelace was born on December 3, 1870, in what was then called the Utah Territory in a town called Payson. His father was from Indiana and his mother was from Massachusetts, and while it's unclear how they met, they were both early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who are also known as Mormons. As such, they were also pioneers who moved out to the Utah Territory to settle and practice their religion unfettered. Because of their religious beliefs, however, it would be much more difficult to identify Joseph. This is because Utah pioneers practice endogamy, which is a practice of only marrying within the local community, but at the same time they practice polygamy, which is the custom of having more than one spouse at a time. As a result of both, Joseph's lineage produced many half-relationships, and according to the DNA Doe Project, one grandparent can produce hundreds of first cousins. And so once genealogists determined Joseph's identity and began more direct research on his life, they found way more than they bargained for. As it turned out, Joseph was an outlaw who lived in a tent on the outskirts of the city during his final days of life, and he was on the run for a very good reason. Much earlier in his life, when Joseph was 28, he married a woman named Harriet Jane Savage of Salt Lake City. It was almost unheard of in those days, but just less than 5 years later, Harriet was granted a divorce from Joseph after he essentially abandoned the family and refused to support the child they had together. Rather quickly, a little more than a year later, Joseph remarried, this time to a woman named Agnes Octavia Caldwell of Bear Lake County, Idaho. Between 1906 and 1913, the couple had 4 children, which Joseph actually did support, but through unsavory means. Joseph got into bootlegging, which was the process of illegally trafficking liquor, and he was first arrested for the crime in March of 1914 in Burley, Idaho. Before the year was out, he was arrested a second time for the same crime, only this time he quickly escaped jail by cutting through the bars of his jail cell with a saw he hid in his boot. Apparently, after his first arrest, he learned to always be prepared in case he got caught. By then, he was wanted on several liquor-related charges and escaping custody, so manhunt got underway, but Joseph would remain on the run for 15 months before police caught up with him again. This time, however, he was arrested under the name Walter Guerin. Part of what made him difficult to keep track of was that police at the time were only casually aware of the lengths Joseph went to in order to hide his real identity. This is because he used many different aliases, particularly with the first name of Walter. And in addition to Guerin, his last names included Cairns, Curran, Currans, and Kernans. Other times, he'd go by the name Charles Smith, leading many to believe that his second wife, Agnes, was also involved in his unsavory activity, as she was known to use the alias Ada Smith when she went into town. In any case, their relationship would come to a horrific end in early May of 1916. Neighbors of the family said that they heard fighting coming from the house one night, and the next morning, Agnes was found in pieces from what looked to be an attack with an axe, and Joseph was nowhere to be found. Newspapers then rushed to cover the murder, and the suspect police were looking for was listed as Charles Smith. While the search was going on, a funeral was held for Agnes, which was also covered by newspapers, and apparently, after overhearing one of Joseph's children, a reporter wrote that the child said that his papa never stayed in jail for very long and that he'd be out soon. 2 days later, those words proved prophetic, as Joseph was both caught and escaped from jail once again. Also, as a quick aside, because of all the aliases, it's not clear if he was being jailed as the same man or as each of the individual aliases. Because of how long ago this happened, some of the sources are also a little vague. Whatever the case, he apparently waited for 5:30 p.m. to roll around, which was when all the guards sat down together for dinner. While they ate, Joseph once again produced a saw from his boot and cut his way to freedom. This, however, would be the last time anyone would see Joseph alive. A wanted poster was then circulated after his escape, calling for the capture of Walt Cairns, said to last be wearing a maroon sweater, light-colored hat, brown coat, and black trousers. Because the clothing found on his body was so similar to what was being reported in the wanted poster, authorities believe that Joseph met his end rather quickly after being caught. It's been speculated that Joseph was killed by his dead wife's family members who were seeking revenge, but that theory is yet to be confirmed. Based on how horrific his body was found though, it seems that whoever did it intended for it to be gruesome, giving some credence to the idea that it was for revenge. But either way, almost 110 years after his death, there are still some parts of Joseph's story that haven't been uncovered. Covering nearly 10,000 acres in the Australian state of New South Wales, the Belanglo State Forest is a dense reforested area that includes some of the earliest radiata pines in the area, planted there in 1919. It's located about an hour from Sydney, and its beauty has made it a popular recreation area for both tourists and native Australians alike. That beauty, however, is contrasted with something a little more sinister. The Belanglo State Forest has earned a reputation as a dumping ground for murderers, most notably serial offender Ivan Milat, who, as you may remember, was convicted of killing 7 backpackers there in the 1980s and 90s. Ivan dispatched his victims in a variety of cruel ways, including using one as target practice. By August 29, 2010, the backpacker murders, as the crimes became known, were a distant memory as several men were spending the day dirt biking around Belanglo. As they rounded a corner along the trail, the lead biker suddenly skidded to a halt, bringing the ride to an abrupt stop for those with him. The others were confused initially until they looked at what the lead rider was stooping over to get a better view of. Scattered around the base of several trees were these skeletal remains and tattered clothing belonging to a woman with her shirt emblazoned with the word angelic. The riders immediately notified authorities, and police were soon on the scene to investigate and document the remains. And among them was Clive Small, the detective who caught the backpacker murderer, and he couldn't help but wonder if the man he captured more than a decade earlier could be responsible for more. An examination of the remains, however, would determine that the woman they belonged to was murdered much more recently, and Ivan was already well into his lifetime prison sentence. This could only mean that there was another murderer at work. When news broke of the remains, police had very little to go on initially, particularly as it pertained to the woman's identity. During a news conference, they simply referred to her as Angel, which was a reference to the shirt she was wearing at the time of her murder. For 5 years afterward, Angel's remains would stay stowed in a forensic lab drawer, unidentified and unclaimed, until one day a mysterious finding was made almost 750 miles or 1,200 kilometers away years later. Carly Pierce Stevenson was a 20-year-old single mother who was described as having a heart of gold. She grew up in a loving, close-knit family, and she ensured that the same was provided to her daughter, 2-year-old Candace Pierce, who was affectionately known as Candles. Carly and Candace lived in Alice Springs in the Northwest Territory, surrounded by doting friends and loved ones. And if Carly had any flaws at all, it's that she was too quick to trust others and saw the good in everyone. In 2008, Carly met a man named Daniel Holdham, who was quite a bit older than her at 33 years old. Despite the age difference though, Daniel swept Carly off her feet, and soon the pair were dating exclusively, to the point where Carly started to introduce him to her friends. It seemed like Carly had finally found a partner she could depend on to provide for her and help raise Candace, but there was something off about Daniel that one of her friends, Tanya, picked up on right away. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but from the start she didn't like him, although she kept this feeling to herself, seeing how happy Carly seemed. And all of this made it even more of a shock when one day in November 2008, Carly's friends and family learned that she and Daniel had left Alice Springs suddenly to look for work elsewhere. In the past, Carly had mentioned wanting to leave Alice Springs, but it wasn't like her to just disappear without saying goodbye. But either way, about a week after Carly and Daniel left Alice Springs, Tanya's phone rang with Carly on the other line in tears. She then went on to explain that she was having regrets about leaving and missed her family very much. It sounded to Tanya like Carly wanted to come home, so Tanya offered to book her a plane ticket or come pick her up, but Carly refused. When the two friends hung up the call that day, it would be the last time they ever spoke. After months of hearing nothing from Carly and having no idea where in the world she might be, Tanya and her mother went to the local police station and filed a missing persons report. Detectives then began working the case and were quickly able to get Daniel on the phone, and just reaching him gave police the impression that they could find a fast conclusion to the case. But he actually went on to tell them that Carly left with Candace and headed to Queensland to start a new life, and he was no longer in touch with them. He also added that Carly didn't want to communicate with her family anymore, which was even more startling to her loved ones. That wasn't the Carly they knew, but her mother decided to respect her daughter's wishes anyway, and the missing persons file was closed. But in fact, regardless of Daniel's claims, Carly would actually sporadically reach out to the family and friends through the middle of 2011, but this was usually only to ask for money. Out of love for Carly and the desire to help her get on her feet in her new life though, her loved ones transferred money whenever she requested it. They were all just thankful to hear from her, even if infrequently, because it let them know that Carly was at least alive and well. In truth, however, Carly was neither, but it would take years and a chance finding before the story of what happened to her and Candace began to become clear. In 2015, while driving down the Karoonda Highway near the small town of Winarka in South Australia, a motorist spotted something along the side of the road that got his interest. He pressed the brake on his truck and slowly pulled off to the shoulder before getting out and walking toward it. As he approached, he recognized it as a carry-on suitcase that someone had abandoned or lost along the highway, but it looked like it had been sitting there for a while, maybe even years. He then bent over and grabbed the zipper, slowly pulling at it and revealing what might be inside. As he flipped it open, he was horrified by the sight. Inside were a tiny set of skeletonized human remains. Sometime later, medical examiners and a forensics team got to work trying to uncover the child's identity and learn how she ended up in a suitcase along the side of a remote stretch of highway. Then, using the skull, a facial reconstruction was created, but when it was checked against a database of missing children, no match was found. So after getting nowhere, investigators held a news conference and appealed to the public for any information that might lead to the girl's identity. While watching the news one day, Tanya saw a report on the body's discovery which included images of the clothing the child was wearing. And immediately, a dreadful feeling came over her as she watched, and when her husband walked in the room, she was almost in tears as she told him she recognized the clothing as belonging to Candace. But either way, despite being shaken by what she had just seen, Tanya picked up the phone and called the Crime Stoppers number that accompanied the report. More than 1,200 calls came in with information in response to the broadcast, but it was Tanya's that broke the case open. Using a DNA profile obtained from the remains, the forensics team ran it against a national database and they got a hit. There was undoubtedly a mother-daughter relationship between the child's skeleton and the woman known as Angel, who was found in the Belanglo State Forest. Thanks to Tanya's phone call providing police with Candace's name, authorities were able to identify the bodies found hundreds of miles away from each other as Carly and Candace. This provided a spark to each investigation, and during interviews with family members, police learned about how the mother and daughter abruptly departed Alice Springs with Daniel. And naturally, this put him at the top of the list of persons of interest in the case. As they start to dig into his background, police discovered a trend of alarming behavior. In 1999, Daniel was arrested after sneaking into a woman's room and attempting to kill her with a pillow wrapped in duct tape. He was convicted the following year, but when he got out of prison, he began stalking her again. And that's not all. Police also learned of something far worse. In 2013, so several years after the disappearance of Carly and Candace, he was arrested and convicted of assaulting an 8-year-old in a caravan park. At the point that he became a prime suspect in the disappearance, he was actually still in custody, so police could take their time and build a solid case against him. But thankfully, they didn't need long. Here's what was determined. In September of 2008, Daniel was driving a vehicle along the Stewart Highway near Alice Springs with his then-girlfriend Hazel and her 2 children. Suddenly, the car skidded off the road and tumbled several times, and while Daniel was relatively unharmed, the accident paralyzed Hazel from the waist down and killed her 2 children. While Hazel was recovering in the hospital, Daniel and Carly's paths crossed and the two began a relationship. Of course, Daniel didn't tell Carly and Hazel about one another, so while in Alice Springs, Daniel began leading a double life. In November, he then convinced Carly to run away with him, which she reluctantly agreed to. Then from Alice Springs, they traveled as far north as Darwin and as far south as Adelaide, where they stopped and stayed at various motels and caravan parks. On December 14, 2008, Daniel drove them to the Belanglo State Park, where he assaulted and killed Carly before taking Candace and traveling hundreds of miles over the next 4 or 5 days. At some point during this, he also got rid of her, put her body in a suitcase, and dumped her along the highway. Following these incidents and upon Hazel's release from the hospital, she happened to find Carly's personal papers in the car and immediately accused Daniel of having an affair, which was certainly the case. And along with her papers was Carly's cell phone, which Daniel then used in the years following to give her family the impression that everything was fine and to solicit money from them. At some point, Daniel even got Hazel into his scheme, getting her to pose as Carly to make several transactions in at least 4 different states and territories in Australia. Together, they managed to extort upwards of $100,000 from Carly's distraught family before all contact ceased in 2011. Hazel contends that her involvement in the scheme to extort money from Carly's family was out of fear of Daniel and not a willingness to participate. But either way, after Carly and Candace's remains were identified on October 21, 2015, police needed just 1 week before he was charged in Carly's murder. It would then take another several months before he was officially charged with the murder of Candace. Daniel, however, maintained his innocence. During the period between his being charged with the murders in 2018, the court system had a suppression order placed on the evidence of the case, meaning the details of the murder and the level of Daniel's depravity were unknown to the public until the order was lifted. When it was, it sent shockwaves throughout the country. It was then learned that when Daniel reached a remote section of the Blanglo State Forest on December 14, 2008, the couple exited the car and a ruthless attack on Carly began that included a glass bottle. After the assault and after she had passed, before he departed the forest, Daniel pulled out a camera and filled an SD memory card with photos of Carly, obviously reveling in what he had done. When he was finished, he left her where she was and went to retrieve Candace from where the couple was living in the Australian Capital Territory. Over the next few horrifying days, Daniel likely did something similar a number of times while traveling to South Australia with Candace. And at some point, 4 or 5 days after he killed Carly, he also did the same with Candace at a motel in the New South Wales town of Narrandera. When she was finally gone, he placed her in the suitcase and tossed it out of his vehicle on a remote stretch of highway hundreds of miles away from where her mother would be found. In the end, Daniel's motive for getting rid of Carly was supposedly just to get his hands on Candace. Daniel's trial was set to begin in August of 2018, but just a week before, he finally confessed the murders. At the New South Wales Supreme Court on November 30th, 2018, Daniel was convicted and sentenced to 2 life sentences, and during the hearing, Carly's father Bruce represented the family and read a prepared statement with Daniel present. In it, Bruce told the court that he had never hated anyone the way he hates Daniel, and that just the thought of what he did to his daughter and grandchild produced so much anger that it made it difficult to breathe sometimes. He added that even the death penalty wouldn't be enough of a punishment for his crimes, but this option was never on the table as the death penalty was abolished in 1955 in New South Wales. Throughout the emotional statement, Daniel sat in court completely stoic with his arms crossed. In several handwritten letters Daniel wrote from his prison cell, he avoided personal responsibility for the murders and pointed the finger for his crimes on a horrible childhood, saying that he was the victim of constant physicality with fists, belts, and wood by his parents. He even alleged that his head would be rammed into cupboard doors, and these incidents caused him to run away several times, only for police to return him to his parents when he was found. He would also go on to say that when the car accident occurred in 2008 that left Hazel wheelchair-bound and her children dead, Daniel said it turned his life upside down and he turned to drugs. He claimed to have made several failed attempts on himself before he ended up with Carly and Candace. Daniel is still serving his life sentences in an Australian prison. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. In case you didn't know already, if you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 cases of people found where they definitely shouldn't have been. And each of these is incredibly creepy, disturbing, and confusing. So as always, viewer discretion is advised. Kasuya is a small town in Japan's Fukoku prefecture with a population today of around 46,000 people. 20 years ago, that figure was just more than 36,000, so it's the type of place that's been growing, but not nearly to the point of bursting at the seams. In 2008, just as it is today, Kasuya was free of the characteristics more often found in big cities like higher crime rates, drugs, and homelessness. For those who preferred a quaint and quiet setting, Kasuya was and still is a solid choice. The 57-year-old man in this story made Kasuya his home for that exact reason. Because his name has never been released publicly, he'll be referred to as Yamada Taro, which is the Japanese equivalent of John Doe. Yamada lived in a cozy one-story house laid out using a traditional Japanese floor plan with each room separated from the next, unlike the open-concept homes seen in the West. It was a modest but comfortable existence, and it was just enough for Yamada. Since he was unmarried and lived alone, everything inside his house was just as he liked it, so when he noticed that food was disappearing from his refrigerator, he was confused. At first, he thought he was just mistaken, but more and more, he was finding less food in his fridge than when he'd leave in the morning for work. There was no obvious explanation for where it was going, and Yamada began to question his own sanity. Keeping track of the food was easy. He paid attention to what he ate, he didn't have pets, no one else had a key to his house, and he didn't have guests over often. Still, it was undeniable that something was happening inside of his fridge when he left the house. After he realized that he was neither mistaken nor crazy, the only thing he could come up with was sleep eating. Sleep-related eating disorder is a real condition that causes those with it to sleepwalk and involuntarily consume food. People with the disorder never even wake up during this phenomenon and have no recollection of it in the morning. But this explanation didn't make sense though. As far as he knew, he'd never even walked in his sleep before. But the disorder can develop slowly or show up suddenly, and in either case, it's a long-lasting condition. There was a chance this could be the answer to the disappearing food, but it seemed unlikely. Those who eat food while sleepwalking often binge eat in the act and injure themselves while traveling to and from the kitchen as well. There's also the threat of choking, house fires, and burns, yet Yamada had no unexplained bruises or burns, and he never woke up feeling like his stomach was full. When he all but ruled that out, he started to wonder if his home was haunted. He'd often hear noises he couldn't find an explanation for. Occasional thumps from another bedroom or the sound of a plastic bottle crinkling somewhere in the house would catch his attention. Yet when he'd go to investigate, he'd find nothing out of the ordinary. Yamada also wasn't the type to entertain the possibility of the supernatural, so he finally came to the conclusion that he was being robbed. The problem with this idea, though, was that there wasn't a single thing anywhere else in the house that was ever disturbed or missing. He'd leave for work each day, then come home and find everything exactly the way he left it until he looked in the fridge. As this continued, he started taking every possible security precaution. Almost obsessively, he checked the windows and doors before he left the house and after he returned home. When he found out that food was still disappearing while everything was locked up tight, Yamada felt his first wave of fear. If he was being robbed, whoever was doing it must have had a key since his doors would always be deadbolted when he returned home. And if he was being robbed, why would someone commit such a serious crime just for a few bites of food? None of what he was experiencing made any sense. If he was going to get to the bottom of what was going on, Yamada had to keep watch over his apartment every minute of every day. So he went out and bought several security cameras and installed them in various places in the house, making sure that one was pointed directly at the refrigerator with a wide view of the kitchen. The video feeds could be accessed from his cell phone, and he'd be alerted if any of them detected motion. So no matter where he was, he'd know the moment something was happening inside his house. Sure enough, not long after he installed the cameras, his phone buzzed with a motion alert. He picked it up and opened the app, and after months of racking his brain to come up with some sort of explanation for his refrigerator being raided almost every day, Yamada finally knew what was happening, and it caused his blood to run cold. He immediately closed the app and called the police to report what he saw. Officers were then dispatched to check the house, but when they arrived and knocked on the door, no one answered. There were no signs of a break-in or anything else suspicious, so they left and called Yamada to let him know that the house was fine. This was not the result he was hoping for. He then asked the police to return to his house, and this time he'd meet them there and let them inside to search. When he got home, Yamada showed the officers what his video feed picked up, and they were just as stunned as he was. They began a thorough search of his house, but he was neat and kept a clutter-free house, so despite what was caught on camera, everything looked just as it should be. One of the officers then entered the last room in the house that had yet to be searched, and it was clearly a room Yamada used sparingly. It was a simple spare bedroom with a perfectly made bed and spotless furniture. It didn't take much to see that nothing was out of the ordinary in the room, so he turned to the closet. When he slid the door open, he jumped back and screamed for the other officer and Yamada. In the corner of the closet was a woman trembling with fear, curled up on her side and hugging her purse to her chest. The officers then placed the woman under arrest and removed her from Yamada's house. The story she told when she was interviewed by police was as beyond belief as it was horrifying. The woman's name was Tetsuko, and she was a 58-year-old homeless woman. Apparently, when Yamada left the house one day, he forgot to lock the door. Kasuya was the type of town where people could leave their doors unlocked with very little chance of consequences. So when Yamada discovered his mistake as he arrived home, it barely registered as anything more than a minor moment of carelessness. In the grand scheme of things, that's exactly what it was, but Tetsuko just happened to be watching as Yamada left his house that day. When his car was out of sight, she approached his door and wiggled the handle. To her surprise, the door opened and she let herself in. In the bedroom closet she was found in, Tetsuko had made herself a home. Built into the closet was a top-shelf cupboard where Yamada neatly kept all of his spare bedsheets and a thin futon mattress. The space was just big enough for her to lie down in, so Tetsuko put the mattress over these stacks of bedsheets on the top shelf, and that's where she slept. When police discovered her hiding spot, it was organized and well kept with the exception of several plastic water bottles around the mattress. This explained the strange popping noises Yamada would occasionally hear, and the dull thumps he heard were caused by Tetsuko accidentally hitting the wall or the closet door. The footage that he captured that day showed Yamada doing his usual last-minute security check before leaving for the day. After he walked out the door, the camera showed a still, silent house. When Yamada had been gone for a while and she was sure he wouldn't be coming back for anything, Tetsuko came down from the closet shelf, wandered into the kitchen, and opened the refrigerator door. She stood there for a while, looking over what Yamada had available to eat. When she spotted something she was in the mood for, she'd take a few bites and then put it back. She did this with a few items before washing it all down with some milk and drinking it straight from the carton. When she was done, she put the milk back, closed the fridge, walked into Yamada's living room, sat down on the couch, and watched television. And she would tell police that she commonly spent the daytime hours performing that exact routine. She'd watch television all day and then return to the closet before Yamada came home. Throughout her time in the house, she would use the bathroom and shower when Yamada was gone, which led police to describe her as neat and clean in the report of the incident. Whenever it was time for Tetsuko to go back into her hiding near the end of the workday, she'd meticulously clean up to remove any trace of her presence. She cleaned the toilet and shower after each use, and she returned anything she used to the exact place she found it. Her ability to essentially live with Yamada and go undetected indicated that this wasn't the first time she had done this. Tetsuko never admitted it, but police believe she had established hiding places in a handful of houses in the area and cycled between them almost on a daily basis. But despite the access to Yamada's home and likely several others, it was surprising to police that she'd never stolen money or any other items of value to sell. Nothing about the case, though, was more stunning than how long Tetsuko had been living in Yamada's home without his knowledge. Since the day she first entered his home, more than a full year had passed. By the time Yamada caught wind of anything going on, Tetsuko had already spent more than 6 months as his uninvited guest. Afterwards, she was charged with trespassing, but when Yamada learned the details from her police interview, he dropped the charges against her and she was allowed to go free. In late September of 2003, the Collective Cabaret Bar in Winnipeg, Canada started to get a reputation for smelling bad. People in neighboring businesses thought that maybe there was a problem with the sewers or something, so every day they'd light incense sticks around the place to eliminate as much of the stench as possible. They hadn't noticed the scent earlier in the year, but after Winnipeg's smoking ban took effect that September, the stench of tobacco stopped masking whatever that smell was. The club did all they could, deep cleaning drains and air ducts and anything else they could think of, but instead of helping, the smell seemed to just get worse. A couple of months later, on December 3rd, some of the bar's neighbors finally couldn't take it anymore and complained to the police. The police then sent a small team to see if they could try to find the source of the smell, and they would manage to determine that the smell seemed to be coming from somewhere downstairs. Then, the closer they got to a wall at the back of the basement, the stronger the stench became. Then they found a small gap in the side of this wall. It was a fake partition made of drywall that leaned against the original concrete walls to make the room square. Whatever they were smelling was definitely behind the wall, but they couldn't get through the gap because it was too small to fit through. They eventually asked a duct cleaning company if they could borrow a remote control camera used to inspect pipes and holes like this, and the company sent the equipment over. Then they fed the camera inside, but as they pushed forward, the lens came loose and fell to the bottom. Luckily, the bar owner planned on renovating the basement anyway, so finally he just let the police break through the drywall to get it. They were able to retrieve both the lens and determine the source of the smell. 14 months before police started investigating, DJ Fenosis, also known as Grandmaster Sanchez, or Eduardo Sanchez to his parents, had a night off. He was well known in the Winnipeg music scene, and he DJ'd at several venues around Winnipeg, but one of his favorite venues was the Collective Cabaret. The Collective was part of an area known as Osborne Village that in the early 2000s was a creative hub for all kinds of alternative music. To Eduardo, it was a little community of people just like him. Like many 21-year-olds, Eduardo also knew how to party. He also worked a day job, and when he wasn't DJing on the weekend, he'd meet up with his friends and they'd head to the Collective for a night out. On Friday, October 11th, 2002, he worked an evening shift and then finished at 11 p.m. Afterward, he wanted to party, so he headed straight from work to meet his friends at the Collective Cabaret. He drank a few beers and a tequila shot or two and eventually drew $80 in cash from an ATM at the entrance at 12:48 a.m. A few hours later, Eduardo left the Collective to talk with some friends in a car parked on the street. Then he walked back to the bar, briefly talking to someone he knew at the entrance before walking back down the stairs that led into the club. And that's the last anyone remembers seeing Eduardo. He was reported missing the next day after he didn't come home, but it took a week for the police to begin looking for him. He was young, and young men were known to disappear for short amounts of time, so they felt they had to make sure he hadn't left on his own free will. Right away, though, Eduardo's sister was convinced that something had happened. She knew it wasn't like him to just disappear. But despite how upset she was about him going missing, she focused on practical ways she could find her brother. As soon as he went missing, she and her friends went out in the evening to put up posters and went to any places Eduardo might have gone around Osborne Village. She also spent days scouring the internet for anything that might be a clue, but a month later, there was still no sign of Eduardo. During this time, his mother was sure he was still alive somewhere and regularly begged for him to come home in the press. The family even held a fundraiser to pay for a private investigator, but the PI couldn't find any trace of Eduardo. 14 months eventually went by since his disappearance, and despite the private investigations and police inquiries, there was just nothing. It was like Eduardo had just walked into the club and vanished. Then, in December 2003, police broke open a fake wall in the basement of Collective Cabaret to look for the missing lens. During this, they found it and the decomposing body of Eduardo. At some point early in the morning, the day he disappeared, Eduardo had decided to go into the club's basement. He was allowed to go down there because it was where they stored records and CDs, and he would regularly go into that room to look for tracks he might play during his next set. Even though he wasn't booked that night, that wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what he did next. At some point, Eduardo seemed to have spotted the small hole in the fake wall. Looking through, he saw the gap between the drywall and the concrete and decided he wanted to explore inside. No one is sure why he chose to crawl between the two walls, but somehow he squeezed himself into a space too small for police officers to fit through and crawled along the top of the gap. The distance between the walls was 73 feet long, and at the top it was a few feet wide, but at the bottom, where the drywall met the concrete floor, there was less than 10 inches of space. According to forensics, Eduardo made it the entire 73 feet before turning around and then coming back. Unfortunately, he managed just 13 feet of this return trip when he lost his footing and fell into the narrow section at the bottom. And as he hit the bottom, he got wedged in a crooked position. He was pinned so tightly he couldn't even expand his chest. His back was trapped against the opposite wall and his neck was forced down, also crushing his airway. He also couldn't move his arms and legs either, meaning he was completely stuck. He probably tried to make as much noise as he could while trying to get free, but there wasn't much noise he could make. He couldn't scream because he couldn't breathe, and he couldn't bang on the wall because his limbs were pinned. Even if he could make noise, no one upstairs would have been able to hear him over the club's music. If they did, who would have thought that a guy had tried to climb down the inside of a basement wall? So, unable to breathe or get unstuck, Eduardo passed out and then passed away. Thankfully for him, he likely lost consciousness in moments, avoiding the pain of the asphyxia-induced cardiac arrest that followed. An autopsy later revealed that his death was due to something known as positional asphyxia, which is when the body is in an unusual position that makes it impossible to breathe. Sometimes it happens when pressure on the back stops the diaphragm from being able to move, and other times the windpipe gets stretched too far after the head gets pinned down into the chest. That also blocks the nose and mouth, restricting breathing even more. Eduardo seems to have had both his back compressed and his head trapped. There's also another form of this called violent positional asphyxia, and it's when someone does that on purpose by kneeling on your back or your neck, but there was nothing to suggest Eduardo's death was the result of that. Incidentally, positional asphyxia is also a common cause of death among cavers and cave divers when they misjudge a gap and get stuck. In the end, police concluded that the gap in the wall was so small that it would have been nearly impossible for anyone to have forced him inside, ruling out foul play. So, it seems that for whatever reason, Eduardo went into the gap that night and then accidentally fell and passed out shortly afterward, leaving him to be found months later. Every year in June at an abandoned orchard 2 miles north of Casnovia, Michigan, there was a keg party. And this was more than just a party, it was a big event, and if you were young, from that area, and at all sociable, you'd be at that party. Despite being a marshy spot with hip-high grass, as far as you can see, it attracted anything from 50 to 100 people most years. In 2005, the date for the party was Saturday, June 11th, and as always, Todd Gieb, who lived nearby, would be there. After getting home, he got dressed up and set off to meet his friends at the Half Moon Bar and Grill in the center of town. They had drinks there for a couple of hours and then left for the big gathering up the road. For most of the night, Todd and his friends drank and danced, and then at around 12:40, a fight started at the party. It's not clear if Todd was involved, but either way, just 5 minutes later, he called one of his friends to tell them that he'd had enough and he was gonna walk home. 2 minutes after that, Todd called another friend. This time, he sounded out of breath and he told her he was in a field and then either hung up or the call was cut off. This was obviously concerning, so the friend called back and the phone was answered, but she wasn't sure if it was Todd or someone else. All she could hear was either heavy breathing or wind, and after that call ended, they tried calling him twice, but the next 2 phone calls just rang until going to voicemail. And his friend was right to be concerned because Todd never made it home that night. Somewhere in the 45-minute from the party to his apartment, Todd seems to have taken a wrong turn. When he didn't get home the next day, his mom filed a missing persons report, and then less than 19 hours after he left the party, search and rescue was out looking for him. They started by setting up teams to search the fields around where the party had been. Then, 2 days after the party on Monday morning, more than 100 people, bloodhounds, a helicopter, and an airboat were added to the hunt. Police also checked the local hospitals and even jails, but Todd wasn't there either. At some point during this, the dogs caught his scent and followed it down a dirt road, but lost it where it ended at a main road. Because of this, police briefly entertained the idea that Todd might have been a victim of a hit and run. Then after getting hit, whoever it was picked him up to cover it up. So afterward, they checked garages and body shops for suspicious activity, but again, this led nowhere. The following day on Tuesday, the search widened, all-terrain vehicles were added, and they began heading into the dense woods and marshes. They even went back over the areas they'd already searched in case they missed anything. But by Wednesday, after the immediate area was thoroughly searched, police concluded he wasn't nearby and pulled their resources out. Understandably, his family kept looking for their son afterward, and they were willing to try everything. They would even go on to hire a psychic, and on June 19th, just over a week after Todd had gone missing, the psychic claimed Todd was dead and that his body was partly submerged close to a lone tree by a small marsh 900 feet from the keg party. Despite skepticism, the police would go out to search the area, but this would again turn up nothing. Amazingly, the psychic seems to have been pretty spot on except for the distance. 3 weeks to the day after Todd went missing, a couple walking on a lake nearby named Ovidal Lake found Todd's body. He was found 1,500 feet to the north of the party, not 900 as the psychic said. Strangely, he was upright in the water with his head and shoulders sticking out close to the marshy shore. The position was so weird that to the couple that found him, he looked like he was swimming. For police, this more or less explained what had happened. Based on how he was found, police suggested that Todd had accidentally set off in the opposite direction from the route that would take him home. Then he walked up the road, climbed over a gate onto a private dirt road, and then toward the lake. At some point during this, he must have dropped his phone because it's never been found. Then, once at the lake, he must have decided to go for a swim, fully clothed, his wallet still in his pocket, and then drowned due to being under the influence. If this explanation is confusing to you, you are not alone. It's not just the circumstances that are weird. Another thing that makes the death suspicious is the autopsy report. The first thing that's strange is that there seem to be conflicting details in the report. For example, at one point it mentions that the body was found face down, and then in another part it mentions the body was found face up. There's also some evidence to suggest that he might not have drowned at all. When someone dies, their blood begins to pool in certain regions of the body, and it causes those parts to discolor. This is known as lividity. If the body had been found face down in the water, that pooling would be in the face and chest, and that's what they discovered. But Todd was found upright, so the question is, when was he lying face down? It had to have been before he got into the water, which means that he must have died earlier. Also, although the report did say he had some water in his lungs, it wasn't consistent with a typical drowning. His toxicology report would also show that he had been drinking, and his blood alcohol content was 0.12, which, for reference, the limit for driving is typically 0.08. So although he was above the limit, it's not nearly as much as you'd expect for someone to go in the exact opposite direction of their house before going for a fully clothed swim in the middle of the night. Stranger still is they found 2 antidepressants in his blood. Not only would the 2 found in his blood not be prescribed at the same time, Todd's doctor knew nothing about him taking either of them. And on top of all of that, his clothes didn't seem to have the amount of bacteria, insects, or dirt on them that they should have had after all that time. He didn't even have any insects on or in him, which is something that usually happens when a body is exposed for that long. Some experts who looked at this evidence later were sure that he'd only been dead for a couple days before they found him. Quite a few experts have also come forward to say that Todd was likely killed on land and then placed carefully in the lake to be discovered. Unfortunately, none of this evidence was enough to convince the police it was more than an accident. They refused to open the case despite pressure from the family, petitions, and even Todd's case being featured on a TV show. To the police, Todd's death remained a tragic, if unusual, accident. There is another theory to explain this, which is incredibly strange, which I normally wouldn't even go over, but I'm going to do here because there's nothing else to go on. In July 2008, Todd's family found a smiley face disc on top of Todd's tombstone 3 years after he died. Initially, they had no idea what this meant, but they were soon put in touch with Kevin Gannon, a retired detective from the NYPD. Kevin and his colleagues are convinced that either a single killer or a group of them had been capturing people and then taking their lives before leaving them to be found in a body of water. This is because there were a string of deaths matching these exact circumstances between the late 1990s and the early 2010s. So far, according to Kevin, this person or these people are responsible for up to 45 deaths in 11 different US states. All the victims fit a type which is white, popular, athletic, and successful in school. Todd fits that description, but that alone is a bit generic. However, this person or these people also tend to leave a calling card in the form of graffiti or something like the smiley face disc Todd's family found. Weirder still, when Kevin asked Todd's mom if there had been any other smiley faces, she said a smiley face with horns had been painted on a tree close to the party where everyone could see it. Now, although this is an interesting theory, and although US law enforcement has found links between all these deaths, they don't necessarily mean the deaths are connected. They feel it's more likely that people who know about the smiley face killer theory are painting graffiti close to any suspicious deaths that fit the profile just to antagonize the police and people who believe the idea. So, that leaves several possibilities. There was the theory suggested by police that Todd was simply under the influence of several substances and accidentally drowned as a result. But at the same time, there are seemingly several inconsistencies with this story. These seem to point that he didn't drown at all and was placed in the lake after the fact. If this was the case, was it simply someone he had a confrontation with, or was it the result of something more calculated? Were the smiley faces found real, or are they simply by people who know the myth? So, what do you think? Let me know down in the comments if you have any ideas. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two incredibly creepy and confusing cases of someone's tragic end. But even more than that, the second story has one of the most cruel and disturbing elements to it that you can possibly imagine. So, as always, viewer discretion is advised. Before we get into the video, I want to introduce you to today's sponsor, CookUnity. If you've been following the channel for some time, you probably know I love a good meal delivery service. In particular, I love the convenience of a fully cooked meal delivered ready to eat, so I couldn't not tell you about CookUnity, which partners with award-winning chefs from across the US and delivers delicious, fully cooked meals right to your doorstep. These meals use fresh, seasonal produce and whole foods prepared by over 50 chefs from some of the best restaurants across the country. CookUnity chefs also offer a wide range of meals with over 7 different dietary preferences, including vegan, paleo, and gluten-free options. The meals are also delivered fully cooked, so all you have to do is heat them up. That means dinner is done in as little as 5 minutes with no more cleanup and meal planning. And ordering these meals is easy and effortless. You choose a subscription plan, which you can cancel at any time, and then select from hundreds of meals each week, also prepared by award-winning chefs. And if you can't or don't have time, CookUnity is even happy to select meals for you based on your taste preferences. Like, for example, check out these meals prepared by these incredible New York chefs. First are these red wine braised short ribs with carrot puree prepared by Chef Marc Forgione. There's also this Moroccan chickpea tagine from Chef Lina Alcosi. And finally, check out this shrimp and chorizo paella prepared by Chef Jose Garces. So, if you want to enjoy restaurant quality meals for a fraction of the price, subscriptions start as low as $11 a meal. And right now, you can check out CookUnity by going to cookunity.com/scary50 or click the link in the description and use code SCARY50 to get 50% off your first order of CookUnity meals to try them out for yourself. Beginning in late 1885, a popular children's publication at the time called St. Nicholas Magazine began publishing installments of a story series that ran for almost a year. In it, a young boy named Cedric and his mother carried on with life after the death of Cedric's father. The mother and son also lived in what was called genteel poverty, which is a term used to describe those who were once wealthy but had fallen on tough times. In the story, one day, Cedric learns that he's the heir to an English earldom, so he and his mother relocate to England so that he could be trained to one day take his rightful place in the nobility. And afterwards, Cedric quickly discovers that his grandfather, who was the earl at the time, wasn't a very good person. On the other hand, because of Cedric's modest circumstances after his father died, he brought a vastly different perspective to his grandfather's life, and over the course of his training, Cedric teaches him what it truly means to be a nobleman. It's a classic rags to riches story with a moral that underscores the importance of being a kind, compassionate person no matter your place in society. The series would end up being such a hit that the author turned it into a novel entitled Little Lord Fauntleroy, which became Cedric's new name when he inherited the earldom. Despite the story's uplifting lesson, however, it's a title that would gain a much darker reputation less than 30 years after its release. On February 6, 1921, Mike Coker was wrapping up a long, grueling day at the O'Laughlin Quarry in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Mike was a pumpman, which was an important job because water is a crucial ingredient in every process of quarry work, and he was eager to finish up and head home. The south end of the quarry had long since been abandoned, so when he saw a woman in a red sweater walking around that area, it immediately got his attention. As he made his way toward the south end, the woman spotted Mike and started heading toward him as well. When they met, Mike could see that she was crying, and then she asked him if he had seen a little boy in the quarry anywhere. Mike almost needed a moment to process the question because it was such an odd thing to be asked in that setting. Mike replied that he hadn't seen a child on quarry property and assured her that if a kid was in the premises, it would have been noticed immediately. She then simply thanked him and turned to walk in the direction of a car that was parked near the south pit. As he watched her walk away, he noticed a man near the car who was looking over the edge of the pit into the pond below. Then when she reached the car, the two got in and drove off. Mike then also finished what he was doing and headed home with a strange story to share with his coworkers the next day. A little more than a month later, on March 8th, another quarry employee was in the south end when he spotted something floating just beneath the surface of the pond. He couldn't immediately tell what it was, but something told him to walk closer to the ledge of the pit to get a better look. Peering down into the still waters, he focused in on an object and suddenly realized what it was. Dozens of feet below the pit ledge was a small, lifeless body. The employee then ran off to the nearest phone to call police, and within the hour, county and state officials were on the site to retrieve the body at what quickly became a somber scene. When the body was pulled out of the water, police laid it face up so an initial examination could take place. The coroner looked the body over and determined it to be a boy of between 5 and 7. Because Wisconsin was dealing with the bitter end of a winter, it was unclear how long the body had been in the water, but the cold had kept it well preserved. Estimates of how long ago the boy might have died ranged from a couple of days to as many as 6 months. As for his appearance, he had a round face with a light complexion and somewhat long blonde curly hair. His clothing also indicated that he came from a well-to-do family that took care of him because he wore a nice blouse with a large collar under a velveteen suit with black stockings and patent leather shoes. After this discovery and after word spread around the quarry on the day the boy was discovered, Mike came forward to tell investigators about his encounter with the woman in the red sweater the month before. Based on this, police came up with an initial theory. Certain areas in the quarry felt far removed from civilization, namely the abandoned southern portion, so couples viewed the area as a lover's lane of sorts and had to be chased off the property periodically. Knowing this, police initially believed that the couple came to the quarry and told their son to wander around for a bit while they remained in the car. While the boy walked around the quarry, investigators thought that he might have